The ocean does not speak, but it listens. It listens to the falling of rain, to the shifting of continents, to the slow crumbling of mountains. It listens to the songs of vanished creatures, to the tremors of the Earth's spine, to the breath of a planet that has been exhaling for billions of years. And if it listens, perhaps it also remembers. What if memory is not just something held in minds or stories, but in matter itself? Not in language, but in layers. Not in books, but in sediments. Beneath the shimmer of the surface and the crash of shallow waves, there is a stillness that deepens into time itself. The ocean floor, like an ancient diary with no author, holds pages written in silt and stone, in the crushed shells of long-dead things, in chemical signatures too faint for our eyes but clear as ink to those who know how to read them. And some do read them. Geologists, paleoclimatologists, oceanographers. They listen for the ocean's whispers in isotopes and fossil remnants, in shifts of carbon and dust frozen in abyssal clay. But even they, like us, are guessing, feeling through darkness, trying to translate what the earth once said, not in words but in weather, not in speech but in silence. Somewhere beneath the weight of 10,000 years of currents lies a drowned coastline, a vanished bay, a civilization with no name, not because it never mattered, but because it was buried before we arrived. Not because it left no trace, but because we do not yet know how to see it. The ocean remembers, even when we forget. This memory is unlike ours. It does not prioritize. It does not arrange history in order. It does not preserve the beautiful and discard the rest. It keeps everything evenly with the same indifference that holds life and death side by side. Bones and barnacles, fire and plankton. A gold ring dropped by a forgotten hand and a volcanic ash cloud settling after a long eruption. They fall into the same story, pressed into the same silt. Time erases shape, but it cannot erase the fact of presence. So we must wonder, what else has been there, waiting, just below the reach of light? We know that water once lapped at the feet of cities now gone. We know that entire forests sleep beneath continental shelves, their roots locked in sediment. We know that the sea has risen and fallen and risen again, like breath. Ice ages carved land bridges, then melted them away. Species migrated across paths that no longer exist. Cultures rose beside rivers whose mouths are now 100 feet underwater. Perhaps their languages are gone. Perhaps their stories are only preserved in the myths of faraway people who speak in riddles about floods and gods and punishment. But maybe, just maybe, they were telling us something true. Not metaphor, not myth, memory. And if memory can drown, what else have we lost? Some scientists have traced the temperature of the ocean through time, using oxygen isotopes in ancient foraminifera, the tiny, delicate skeletons of plankton that rain down onto the seafloor over millions of years. Others look to manganese nodules and the slow accretion of metal-rich stones that take thousands of years to form a single centimeter. Still others study the carbon locked within the oldest ocean mud, trying to reconstruct the climates that once were, the atmospheres that once pressed down on forgotten worlds. This is not imagination. This is science. But science, too, begins with wonder, with the question behind the question. Could it be that the ocean knows more about us than we know about it? For all our satellites and probes, for all our charts and measurements, we have seen only a fraction of what lies beneath. Some say we know more about the surface of Mars than we do about our own seafloor. And maybe that's true, because this ocean, the one we sail on, swim in, build next to, is not one ocean. It is a collection of eras, of tectonic collisions, of extinct coastlines and ancient rivers drowned by time. It is not just water. It is a layered memory of Earth's transformations. When we look at the sea, we see motion. But beneath that motion is permanence. Fossils formed in oxygen-starved darkness. Volcanic ridges that mark the slow unzipping of the planet. Subduction zones where entire continents are pulled under like breath being drawn in again. The ocean has swallowed mountains, preserved meteor craters, buried forests that burned before mammals ever walked the land. It has taken the past and made it heavy, pressed it down, let time pass over it, and now it waits, Not for us necessarily, but it waits nonetheless. What we find beneath the waves may not resemble what once was. The faces are gone. The voices are lost. But the traces remain. The ocean forgets nothing. It simply holds its memory in a different language. And perhaps, if we learn to listen, not with ears but with patience, we might hear something ancient speak. Not in thunder, not in revelation, but in the slow crumbling of rock. In the echo of a sonar ping that bounces back too quickly. In the curve of a seamount that doesn't belong. Because if the oceans remember, then we are surrounded by memory every time we stand at the shore. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? We are taught to read maps as records of certainty. Shorelines drawn in black. Mountains inked with shadows. Depth measured in color gradients that grow darker with descent. But the most haunting parts of any map are the blank spaces. The places not marked. The outlines that used to be but now are not. The gaps where something might have been, might still be, if only we knew how to look. We have always trusted the visible. But the ocean does not give itself easily to sight. It withholds, conceals. It erases outlines gently with patience over thousands of years. And yet, even in its silence, it leaves impressions. Subtle rises in the seafloor. Gentle curves where land once rose above water. Satellite scans detect irregular patterns beneath the waves. Ridges shaped not like nature's randomness, but like memory pressed into stone. Not because they are structures necessarily, but because they feel intentional. Wrong somehow in their symmetry. There is a kind of absence that speaks louder than presence. A shelf that drops too suddenly. A plateau where there should be none. A straight line beneath 2 miles of water, cutting through silt like an old scar on skin. Across the world, there are names whispered for these absences. Sunderland, Doggerland, the Bering Land Bridge, places that once connected continents. Not ideas, not theories, these were real lands. Forests, coasts, rivers where animals drank and humans built their lives. And now they are gone, swallowed by sea level rise, pulled under by the slow collapse of glacial ages. Still present, beneath the waves, but invisible unless we know how to trace the shape of what isn't there. And maybe the absences are not always ancient. Maybe some are younger. Maybe some lands disappeared not over millennia, but in moments. A quake, a surge, a sudden sink into liquefied ground. And maybe that is why so many myths speak of drowned worlds, not as metaphor but as memory too old for precision. Could it be that what we call myth is geography we no longer recognize? Consider the continental shelf, the gentle slope stretching far beyond our beaches, as if the land never meant to end where it does. If sea levels dropped just a few hundred feet, entire coastlines would reappear. Valleys, caves, paths once used by animals migrating with the seasons. Maybe even stone rings built for watching the stars. Maybe even hearths that once held flame. The evidence is sparse, but the absence is immense. And in the gaps between certainty and speculation, something stirs. Not proof, not fiction, but wonder. We send sonar across the seafloor and it draws outlines with echo. We launch satellites that scan for gravitational anomalies. We measure magnetic fields, map crustal thickness, trace fault lines through layers of sediment. And still, much of what we learn comes not from what is found, but from what is missing. It is the pattern interrupted, the shape not aligned, the silence where we expected sound. Sometimes absence is a fingerprint. Perhaps we've been trained to ask the wrong questions. Instead of always wondering what's there, maybe we should ask what used to be, what's no longer visible, not because it never existed, but because time and water have changed the way it appears. And if we redrew the world, not with borders or roads but with memory, what might the map look like? A wider coastline, a broader archipelago, forgotten ridges, lost estuaries, whole civilizations not yet discovered, not because they were unimportant, but because they lived in places that now belong to the sea. It is hard to know what to trust. Shapes can deceive. Patterns can mislead. The ocean floor is full of riddles. Long rows of lines, curious formations that could be natural erosion, or the softened outline of something else. We are cautious, and rightly so. Science demands skepticism, but imagination walks beside it, quietly, like a shadow that does not need to prove itself to be real. And so we wait. We gather data. We scan the blue void for more hints. We layer image upon image until faint outlines begin to suggest what once was. Not in sharp relief, not in certainty, but in feeling. There are no clear maps for what is missing, but still we trace them. In echo, in depth, in silence. We are learning to read not just what is drawn, but what has been erased. Because the erasure tells a story too. And maybe, just maybe, the outlines we seek aren't gone at all. They are just sleeping. And if a coastline can vanish, if a continent can sink, then surely some things we've forgotten were never meant to be found on land. Beneath the calm sway of every passing boat lies a world we almost never see. While waves shimmer with sunlight and wind draws its quiet patterns across the surface, far below, the seafloor rests in perpetual night, unchanging, silent, patient. It waits, holding secrets older than any city, older than the word civilization itself. Every time a sonar pulse travels downward, it brushes the edges of something unknown. The signal scatters, bounces, returns, a faint echo that should not exist, an outline that feels too deliberate, too symmetrical, too human. The first time scientists saw these echoes, they thought it was error. Machines misreading geology. But error has a rhythm, and this had design. Angles that mirrored one another. Lines aligned with precision, as though once measured by intent. Not proof of anything, not yet, but enough to stir the oldest kind of curiosity, the one that whispers, what if? The ocean floor is a mosaic of forms, ridges, trenches, plateaus, and yet, some of these forms refuse to fit the pattern. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Formation rises from the seabed like a staircase carved for giants. In the Mediterranean, sonar traces suggest walls buried beneath layers of silt. Near the Bahamas, lines of stone extend in unnatural regularity. We call them coincidences, but coincidence, repeated too often, begins to resemble memory. Maybe these ghosts are not structures at all. Maybe they are the sea's sculptures, made by pressure, heat, and time. But what if they aren't? What if something once stood there, something that touched the stars before vanishing beneath the waves? We cannot be sure. The ocean does not reveal its truths easily. It wraps them in salt and distance and the heavy weight of forgetting. Every sonar map is an act of translation. Sound turned to shape, shape turned to story. But translation is imperfect. It loses nuance, adds illusion. The human eye completes what is missing, just as the mind fills the dark with meaning. When we stare at these shadows beneath the sea, we are also looking inward, at our longing for connection to the unrecorded past. We want to believe that somewhere under the blue, a civilization still sleeps, preserved in stone and silence. And yet, perhaps the ghosts are simpler than that. Maybe they are geological memories of the planet itself. Mountains once above the waves, ground down by erosion, their edges softened until they resemble ruins. The earth builds and erases itself constantly. Volcanoes rise, continents drift, trenches swallow whole regions into molten quiet. To look at the seafloor is to see the process of remembering and forgetting written in stone. Still, the shapes call to us. The sonar image repeats on screen. A perfect rectangle, a column's shadow, a staircase. The human brain lights up. We are wired to find pattern, to sense design in chaos. But the question remains, are we discovering the past or inventing it? Divers descend with lights and cameras, their bubbles rising like prayers through the dark. They touch the stone, measure, photograph, debate. Some swear they feel intention in the angles, the way the blocks interlock, the way steps align with what might have been sunrise. Others remind us that nature too is a builder, one that sculpts on scales we can barely imagine. Currents carve like chisels. Time erodes like breath. Maybe both are true. Maybe human hands and natural forces have always worked together, indistinguishable after millennia. Maybe the ghosts beneath our boats are reminders that our distinction between natural and human is much younger than the world itself. We keep searching, not for treasure, but for confirmation that the ocean remembers us, that our stories matter enough to leave a mark. In a way, every sonar ping is an act of listening to the past. Each echo is a heartbeat coming back from the dark. The deeper the water, the further sound must travel. It bends, distorts, returns altered, just as memory does. The echoes are not lies. They are memories refracted through time, through distance, through water that has forgotten the language we once spoke. And so, we listen again. Perhaps what stirs beneath the keel is not the architecture of a lost people, but the reflection of our own need to believe that we were not the first, nor will we be the last. That before us, others walked their own coastlines, looked out over their own horizons, and wondered what lay beyond. The ghosts are not only beneath us, they are within us. Shadows of curiosity, persistence, longing. They remind us that discovery is not always about finding what is real, but about remembering that something could be. And yet, if these echoes are only shadows of memory, then somewhere, something must have cast them. Every second, the ocean writes a sentence. A grain of sand falls, a shell drifts down, a particle of dust from a desert half a world away settles quietly into darkness. Each one lands atop another, pressing faintly, gently, adding weight to memory. The process is invisible to us, but constant. Over thousands of years, those soft accumulations become archives. Over millions, they become stone. And within that stone, within those compacted sighs of time, sleep the remnants of everything that has ever fallen. When we speak of the past, we imagine it behind us. But the earth keeps it below us. Layer by layer, it builds a record not of moments, but of patience. The silt is the handwriting of deep time, written slowly enough that no single generation can see the sentence forming. Yet, when we bore into the seabed and lift a core sample to the surface, we unspool an ancient story, millimeter by millimeter, century by century. In those thin cylinders of mud, the planet tells its secrets. Shifts in oxygen isotopes record the pulse of ice ages. Volcanic ash layers announce eruptions that once blackened the skies. Tiny fossils, plankton, shells, dust, speak of vanished climates, drifting continents, changing seas. Each layer is a whisper from a world that existed long before our own. The deeper the layer, the older the whisper. Erosion, that quiet sculptor, ensures that nothing lasts forever on the surface. Mountains wear down, rivers carry their remains to the sea, and the sea swallows them whole. But in the depths, the opposite occurs. Erosion's debris becomes preservation. What is destroyed above is recorded below. Every collapse, every storm, every flood writes itself into silt. The ocean does not forget. It simply rephrases. To a geologist, this slow burial is both miracle and mystery. Within 1 meter of sediment, there may be 10,000 years of memory. Within 10 meters, entire epochs. Yet these archives are fragile. Pressure and heat transform them, folding stories into new forms, compressing history until it becomes indistinguishable from the rock itself. The earth edits its own diary, but never stops writing. Tectonics move the pages. The seabed rises, folds, dives again into the mantle, carrying its records into molten silence. Whole eras vanish not because they were unimportant, but because the planet recycles its own memory. Still, fragments survive. On mountain tops that were once ocean floor, we find fossils of coral and ammonites. Proof that even lost pages sometimes return to the surface, rewritten as stone. Time does not vanish. It simply changes rooms. Think of a handful of silt lifted from the seabed. It looks unremarkable, gray, fine, unformed. But hidden within are histories of continents, of climates, of life that pulsed and ended long before our species existed. Each grain might have begun as volcanic glass, as a piece of bone, as dust from a meteor impact that once veiled the sun. When you hold that silt, you are holding the condensation of eons. You are holding what time becomes when it sleeps. Scientists drill into these sediments not to disturb them, but to listen. They use isotope analysis to trace the slow breathing of the planet, its cycles of warmth and cold, its extinctions and renewals. They measure the thickness of layers to calculate the speed of forgetting. Some sediments accumulate quickly, burying catastrophe in months. Others build so slowly that 1 inch represents centuries of quiet drift. And yet, for all our precision, there is still wonder. Because even now, new layers are forming. Right beneath our ships, under the restless motion of waves, dust from our cities is settling. Microplastics, soot, pollen, fragments of our own making, all falling silently to join the record. We are becoming another stratum, another whisper waiting to harden into stone. One day something might read us the way we read ammonites and ash. Maybe they will find traces of our warmth, our combustion, our noise. Maybe they will wonder who we were. It is humbling to know that time's deepest stillness is built from constant motion. Silt never stops falling. The earth never stops remembering. It simply takes its time, longer than we can fathom. To look at sediment is to look at patience made visible. Beneath every sea, beneath every drifting current, time sleeps. Not dead, but dreaming, waiting to be read by those who listen softly enough to hear what stone is trying to say. And yet, if even silence can record so much, what else might be hiding in the layers we have not yet touched? In the deep folds of the seabed, where sunlight has never touched and pressure holds silence in its grip, there are fossils that sleep strangely. Not because they are there, but because of when they are there. They are bones and imprints, fragments and forms, and sometimes they don't belong where we find them, or when. Most fossils behave like clockwork, layered in order, species rising, changing, vanishing, their remains locked into geological strata like pages in a well-ordered book. But sometimes a bone is found in the wrong chapter, a tool where no tool should be, a structure where only sediment should lie, a fossil that whispers, "I do not fit." And it is in those moments when the timeline phrase that wonder begins. They call them OPArts, out-of-place artifacts. The name alone carries controversy. Some are explained by upheaval, by the misfolding of stone or the intrusion of later material into older earth. Others resist explanation. Objects embedded too deep, metals found in coal seams, tracks impressed into ancient stone, often dismissed, often ridiculed, but still, they linger, like echoes of stories we forgot how to tell. The ocean holds many of these questions, not because it preserves them perfectly, but because it hides them well. Off coasts long thought barren, beneath sediments laid down before recorded history, divers and dredges have brought up things that puzzle. Carved shapes, tool-like objects, geometries too regular to dismiss as accident. Often degraded, often indistinct, but enough to stir discomfort in certainty. Could it be that memory is more fragile than stone? That we've lost more than we've kept? Even more curious are the technofossils, an idea not of strange ancient relics but of ourselves. The term comes from scientists studying what traces we, the modern world, are leaving behind. Plastics that drift into sediment, aluminum that resists decay, nuclear isotopes embedded into the very crust of the planet. Technofossils are not myths, they are inevitable. Proof that long after we are gone, something synthetic, something unmistakably ours, will remain in the rock. And yet, if our world will leave such artifacts behind, could others have done the same? It is not impossible, just unlikely, or so we're told. The Silurian hypothesis, proposed by mainstream scientists, asks a question that sounds more like science fiction than science. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, how would we know? And the answer is chilling in its humility: we might not. Plate tectonics would erase most structures. Cities would vanish. Corrosion, subduction, entropy. The Earth is good at forgetting. Only a faint chemical signal, carbon anomalies, unusual isotope spikes, synthetic compounds embedded in clay might remain. And those signals? Some do exist. Paleoclimatic records reveal sudden carbon shifts, strange temperature spikes, ocean acidification events. We attribute them to natural causes: volcanoes, methane bursts, asteroid strikes. And maybe that's exactly what they are. But maybe not all of them. Could an ancient epic, long before us, have risen and fallen? Could its remnants have become indistinguishable from nature's scars? Could it have left behind its own technofossils, now reburied, now overlooked, now mistaken for something else? We do not know. But the possibility itself is a kind of fossil, an imprint left in our imagination, a shape that does not match the rock around it. A question embedded in silence. And as we scan the oceanic crust, as we core through layers of time, we keep finding small puzzles. Fossils of species that appear too early, disappear too late. Tools in strata that predate known humans. Metallic nodules shaped like gears, but eroded beyond clarity. Most are likely misidentified. Some are hoaxes, but even a few true anomalies are enough to unsettle the timeline. Maybe we are not the first to stand where we stand. Maybe we are not the only intelligence Earth has nurtured and lost. The sea would remember. It always does. But it speaks in layers, not language. And its memory is disguised as stone. Somewhere beneath the Pacific, beneath miles of pressure and silt, an artifact may sleep, utterly alone, utterly unrecognizable. Not because it's broken, but because we have no frame to understand it. Or perhaps it's already been found, labeled as natural, filed away in a drawer, its story left unread. The fossils that shouldn't exist remind us that we do not know everything, that the record is incomplete, that history is not a straight line, but a spiral, looping through mystery. And if we have already forgotten this much, what might we be forgetting right now? Long before lungs ever drew air, before bones formed, before eyes opened, there was only water. And in that water something stirred. Not life as we know it, but the raw potential molecules drifting, dancing, colliding in warm, mineral-rich seas. The ocean did not create life like an architect. It allowed it gently, without rush. In the slow chemistry of early Earth, life assembled itself from nothing but time, warmth, and patience. And so the sea became a cradle. It held the first cells, small and soft, with no purpose but replication. For eons they floated, blooming and vanishing, learning how to survive. Then, somewhere in that quiet womb, a mutation sparked. One organism began to change. Then another. Photosynthesis, life breathing light into itself. Oxygen began to gather, slow as breath, and the planet shifted. New kinds of creatures emerged. Not overnight, not with noise, but gradually, like light rising behind mist. Trilobites, jellyfish, early fish with armor-like skin. All of them dreamed through the ocean's silence, evolved in its softness, moved with its pulse. Life did not simply live in the ocean, it belonged to it. For hundreds of millions of years, the ocean was everything. It was home, horizon, world. Land was an afterthought. Even now, much of Earth's living memory remains in the water. Coral reefs that record the seasons like tree rings. Whale songs that pass through generations. Microbial mats in hydrothermal vents. Living fossils unchanged for billions of years. The ocean is not just where life began. It is where life still returns to understand itself. But what cradles also contains. What nurtures also buries. And what begins in water often ends there too. Extinction does not shout. It whispers. Ocean temperatures rise by degrees. Oxygen levels drop. Acid spreads unseen. The surface looks calm. But beneath, entire kingdoms vanish. Species disappear not in fire, but in forgetting. 5 times in Earth's past, life collapsed. The Great Dying, 252 million years ago, emptied the sea of nearly all its breath. Oceans grew acidic, anoxic, deadly. Coral died. Fish suffocated. Even the plankton, the tiny architects of the food chain, vanished. The sea, once mother, became a tomb. But it kept the record. It pressed the shapes of the dead into sediment. It fossilized shells and bones, froze extinction into geology. And then, It began again. The ocean forgets nothing. It just layers the story. We often think of extinction as erasure. But the Earth is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over, but never fully erased. Fossils lie stacked atop one another like pages, each one holding an echo of what once was. The Cambrian seas, the Devonian reefs, the silent, sulphurous oceans of the Permian. Each epoch preserved in silence. Even now, in our own age, the ocean continues to cradle and to bury. Plastic swirls in its gyres. Carbon dissolves into its currents. Species blink out one by one, too quietly for most to notice. We are living in what some call the sixth extinction, but unlike those before, this one is not born from volcanoes or asteroids. It is slow, human, and unseen. Still, the ocean holds us. Still, it records. And perhaps one day, long after we are gone, our technofossils will settle into its archives. Skeletons of cities, fragments of code, isotopic fingerprints of fire and industry. What began in the ocean may end there too. Not as punishment, but as return, as completion. And yet, even in its role as tomb, the sea does not despair. Continues to carry life. In vents beneath the crust, new species are still discovered: blind shrimp, sulfur-eating worms, bioluminescent jellyfish that pulse like deep-time memories. There are places no light has ever touched, and yet life still flickers there. As if to say, this story is not finished. Because the ocean is not a grave. It is a vault, a memory box, a breathing archive of everything that has ever been and might be again. What cradled us may one day take us back. Not as loss, but as layering. Not as disappearance, but as sediment. And if the ocean is both our beginning and our end, then somewhere in its deepest stillness we are already home. But if this is true, if the sea holds every birth and every extinction, then what might it still be holding now, unspoken, unexamined, untouched beneath the drifting veil of silt? The planet remembers, but it does not speak in language. It speaks in layers. It speaks in pressure, in heat, in stone. Where we keep our memories and stories and songs, Earth keeps its memory in form. Folded, compressed, sometimes broken, sometimes buried, but never truly lost. And of all its keepers, geology is the most patient, the most enduring, the oldest storyteller of all. Beneath the ocean's surface, where darkness is permanent and sound travels slowly, the seafloor forms a kind of living library. Not in books or scrolls, but in strata, sheets of sediment laid down one breath at a time, one storm at a time, one extinction at a time. Each band is a sentence, each shift a chapter, and the seabed, with its calm, steady accumulation, records what the rest of the world forgets. At the surface, time moves quickly. Wind reshapes dunes. Rivers change course. Forests burn and regrow. But under the sea, everything slows. Particles settle. Bones drift downward. Volcanic ash rains from far-off eruptions. Even dust from space finds its way into the record. Over thousands of years, these fragments press into each other, forming layers that compress memory into stone. The deeper you go, the further back you travel. Geologists speak of cores, cylindrical samples pulled from the ocean floor. To hold one is to hold time. In a single meter, you may pass through glacial periods, mass extinctions, great thaws, and slow freezes. Microscopic shells of plankton reveal ocean temperatures. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in those shells tells us about ice caps and sea levels. Carbon traces whisper of forest fires. Mercury levels hint at ancient volcanism. Each element, each mineral, is a storyteller with its own voice. And then there are the plates, the giant rafts of crust that drift atop the molten mantle. They shift by inches, but over eons, those inches become continents colliding, mountains forming, oceans opening and closing like lungs. Subduction zones pull old seabeds into the Earth's interior, recycling crust into magma. But before they're consumed, those slabs carry entire epochs upon their backs. Fossils, sediment bands, chemical memories all pressed tight. To read this record is to learn how to see the invisible. To listen not with ears, but with curiosity. Because geology does not tell a single tale. It tells overlapping ones, slow, layered, unresolved. A story of fire beneath ice. A story of coral reefs growing where deserts now lie. A story of earthquakes reshaping everything in seconds, only to be forgotten by the surface in days. But the rock remembers. It remembers the asteroid that fell 66 million years ago and marked the boundary with iridium-rich clay. It remembers the methane burps that warmed the seas, the sudden acidification that killed the reefs, the silence that followed. And it remembers the recovery, life returning not as it was but as something new, changed, not ended. In this way, geology is not just a record of endings. It is a memory of resilience, of return, of time not as a line but as a rhythm. Even now, we are being recorded. Every city, every spill, every fire leaves a trace. Plastic particles drift downward. Radioisotopes from mid-century tests settle into the mud. We are becoming another layer, another band in the book of Earth. A layer that future beings, if they come, might read the way we read chalk beds and basalt flows. And what will they think? Will they recognize the sharpness of our arrival, the heat of our presence, the sudden bloom, and the just as sudden silence? We cannot know, but the record will remain. Because geology does not forget. Cannot. It is memory turned to matter, pressure turned to testimony, silence shaped. And if the ocean floor tells the oldest story, then somewhere, beneath all those layers, lies the first sentence Earth ever wrote. But if we have come this far by reading stone, what might still be written in the strata we have not yet reached? In every culture, there are stories of places that vanished beneath the sea, cities swallowed by water, civilizations gone in a single terrible moment, tales of floods, of gods, of punishment. But beneath the metaphor, there is a tremor of truth, because sometimes the earth really does change in a day. We often forget how fragile land is. We think of continents as permanent, coastlines as fixed. But the sea is never still. It rises, it reclaims, it forgets. And sometimes it takes without warning. What if these ancient stories, Atlantis, Dvarka, Yanaguni, Doggerland, are not inventions but memories? Not myths, but imperfect recollections of real places that once breathed, once thrived, and then sank? Atlantis is perhaps the most famous, first told by Plato nearly 2,400 years ago. A great and powerful city, technologically advanced, morally complex, and in the end, lost beneath the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. Most dismiss it as allegory, a fable warning of hubris. But Plato insisted it was history, passed down through generations. Could it have been inspired by something real? Geology offers possibilities. The eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, for instance, a cataclysmic volcanic event in the Aegean Sea, wiped out entire islands, sent tsunamis cascading through the Mediterranean. Civilizations collapsed. Coasts redrew themselves. Perhaps not Atlantis, but perhaps a city, remembered imperfectly. And far from Greece, in the warm shallows off the western coast of India, divers have found something just as strange. Stone structures off the coast of Gujarat, near the city of Dvarka. Blocks aligned too precisely to be natural. Pavements beneath the waves. Pottery, tools, human artifacts. Some say it's the legendary city of Lord Krishna, said in Sanskrit texts to have sunk beneath the ocean long ago. Others urge caution. But the radiocarbon dates are old, older than expected, and the sea again is silent. In Japan's southern waters lies Yanaguni, a submerged platform that appears to have steps, terraces, symmetrical forms. Some say it's a natural formation, the result of fracturing sandstone. Others believe it was shaped by human hands, then lost to the rising sea. Divers swim along its edges and wonder, could this be a ruin too ancient for our records? Or are we simply seeing patterns where none were meant to be? And then there's Doggerland, less legend, more fact. A lost landmass that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, now submerged beneath the North Sea. It was lush, full of lakes, forests, rivers. a place where animals roamed and humans lived. Then the glaciers melted. The sea rose. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive tsunami triggered by a submarine landslide finished what climate had begun. In hours, a thriving region became seabed. No myth, no metaphor, just silence where life once thrived. These drowned landscapes are not isolated anomalies. They are echoes, patterns, memory made geological. And yet, we have barely begun to look. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. Beneath that lie entire histories still unread. Whole continents may have shifted and submerged before written language was ever born. If cities can drown in a day, civilizations can vanish in a century, and take their stories with them. We tend to measure history by what we can excavate. But what if the most important parts of our past lie somewhere we haven't thought to dig? What if the record is wrong not because it was falsified, but because it was incomplete? Geologists have shown that sea levels have risen and fallen more than 400 feet across the last ice ages. That's enough to swallow not just towns, but whole cultures, layered along coasts we no longer see. What might lie just beyond the continental shelf? What knowledge, what structures, what names? And deeper still, what if some of those stories are not even ours? Could intelligence have risen before us, on timelines erased by erosion and tectonics? Could there have been other epochs, ancient, technological, now reduced to anomalies in rock? The Earth is old enough to forget itself, but sometimes it remembers through myth, through whispers passed down, altered and embellished, but still anchored in something that happened. A deluge, a disappearance, a city beneath the sea. We've found enough to be unsure, not enough to be certain. That's where wonder lives, in the space between evidence and imagination, in the sonar shadows, in the ancient texts, in the pause between waves. Maybe Atlantis was not one place but many. Maybe it's a symbol for all that has ever been lost too suddenly to record. And maybe that's why the sea feels so familiar, so haunted, because part of us remembers what it once took away. And if this many stories survived, how many more were drowned without even a name to hold on to them? The ocean is not only a keeper of memory, it is also its undoing. In stillness it cradles, but in silence it also forgets. And not out of cruelty, not by design. It is simply the nature of things. In the deep, where pressure grows and light fades, entropy reigns. Not with violence, but with infinite patience. Even memory dissolves. Imagine a shipwreck. At the moment it slips beneath the surface, it carries a full story. Wood and iron, rope and canvas, coins and cargo, voices and intentions. A floating history, entire. But the water has no interest in preservation. The salt begins its work. The organisms arrive. Pressure presses inward, slowly crushing edges that once held shape. What was once sharp becomes softened. What was once living becomes colonized by life entirely different. After years, the wreck is no longer a vessel. It is reef. It is home to fish and coral, barnacle and sponge. Its original meaning fades. Its outlines blur. And in time, perhaps centuries, perhaps millennia, it becomes unrecognizable. Not because it was erased, but because it was transformed. This is entropy underwater. Salt weakens metal, pulling molecules apart grain by grain. Wood swells, splits, dissolves into pulp. Organic material, leather, bone, fabric, melts into silt, unless entombed in anoxic mud or frozen in deep cold. In the abyss, pressure reshapes even stone. Structures collapse. Angles slump. Nothing stays as it was. Time is the true sculptor here. Not carving, but softening. Not erasing all at once, but smudging the edges, until what's left no longer resembles what began. Even geology, long thought permanent, falls to this quiet undoing. Volcanic ridges break apart under the slow force of tectonics. Seamounts erode. Canyons form under the weight of gravity-driven currents. Sediment slides down slopes in submarine avalanches, burying records and exposing older scars. All the while, chemical reactions tick forward, unceasing. Iron rusts, calcium dissolves, glass devitrifies, And yet, somehow traces remain. Not whole things, not readable memories, but hints, shapes, impressions, like dreams you only half remember upon waking. In the deepest parts of the ocean, where oxygen cannot reach, where microbes are few, some objects last longer. Here, decay is slowed but not stopped. Even in perfect darkness, entropy has its way. Isotopes decay, crystals shift, molecules loosen their bonds. The end is slower, quieter, but it still comes. Consider a stone monument, lost to a flood 12,000 years ago. If it fell on land, wind and rain would carve it down. If it fell into the sea, the process would differ but not halt. Colonies of sea life would claim its surface. Microorganisms would begin to feed on the faint residues of what once was. Sand would grind against its faces. Minerals in the water would seep into its cracks, expanding, fracturing. And over time, the monument would cease to be a monument. It would become stone again, just stone. And yet, something of it remains. That's the paradox. Even as entropy works to erase, it leaves a trace of the erasure. We see outlines in sonar, but the details are gone. We find an unusual rock with smooth sides, but its context is lost. We dig into a seafloor core and find chemical signatures, carbon, mercury, sulfur, recording events we cannot name. Entropy does not lie. It simply forgets faster than we can learn. Still, we try. We scan the seafloor with magnetometers, looking for disturbances. We examine deep sediment for isotopic clues. We reconstruct ancient coastlines from shifting sediment bands. We search for what the ocean no longer remembers clearly: ruins, cities, tools, voices. And sometimes we find them, but more often we find only the absence. The hollow, the shape of something once there. It is humbling to know how easily time unthreads the things we build. It is humbling to realize that memory itself, like coral, like steel, like myth, can dissolve. But perhaps this is not loss. Perhaps this is just the way Earth moves forward. To forget in form so that it can remember in rhythm. Because even as the past decays, the patterns remain. Floods return. Climates shift. Plates move. The story, in broad strokes, repeats, even if the details blur. And so we trace echoes knowing they fade. We listen to stone, knowing it forgets. We accept that entropy is not an enemy, but a quiet keeper of impermanence. And yet, if even the sharpest monuments dissolve beneath the waves, what might still be hiding, softened, buried, misunderstood, beneath the ocean's steady forgetting? In the dark places where light cannot reach, we learn to see with sound. Down there, in the cold abyss beneath waves and weight, the world does not offer its shape willingly. So we send out pulses, little bursts of hope, tiny questions launched into the silence. And we wait for the echo. Sonar is our voice underwater. It is our way of asking, what lies beneath? What are you hiding? The answer comes not in words, but in timing, in texture, in the soft return of energy bouncing back from the unknown. Ping, a pause, a response. The rhythm of exploration in a world too dark to map with eyes alone. But these echoes are imperfect, distorted by depth, temperature, currents. They return changed, bent, softened, sometimes confused. We learn to read them not as facts, but as suggestions, possibilities, anomalies. The ocean floor, once imagined as smooth and featureless, is now known to be as rugged as any mountain range. Trenches deeper than Everest is tall. Ridges that stretch like veins beneath entire oceans. Canyons carved by ancient currents. All of it revealed through sonar's patient tapping. It is not a picture exactly, more like a shadow cast by distance, a suggestion of form. We build 3D images from echoes, digital reconstructions from the faintest reflections. Entire underwater landscapes bloom on screens, drawn by data that never touched the surface. And sometimes, the shapes surprise us. Straight lines, right angles, structures that seem too deliberate. A series of steps, a flat platform, pattern that repeats. Sonar doesn't say what something is. It only tells us where to look closer. But when those echoes come back strange, too regular, too symmetrical, they whisper questions. Questions about what once stood there. Or who. Sonar alone cannot answer. So we bring in other tools. Magnetometers read the subtle disturbances in Earth's magnetic field, scanning for metal, for density changes, for what does not belong. Sub-bottom profilers go deeper, sending sound waves down through the layers of sediment, peeling back time itself. With them, we see not just the surface, but the buried past, the outlines of old riverbeds, the shadows of ancient coastlines, even the faint suggestion of ruins long entombed in mud. Each tool speaks a dialect of the same language: echo, reflection, return. But translation is never simple. A straight line may be a rock shelf. A rectangular shape may be a trick of erosion. And yet, sometimes they are not. Sometimes we find shipwrecks exactly where the echo said they'd be. Ancient harbors traced beneath centuries of silt. Sunken cities sleeping beneath layers of sand and salt. And sometimes, just sometimes, we find shapes we cannot explain. We try to resist the urge to see too much. The brain is eager to fill in gaps, to draw meaning where there may be none. But the ocean invites speculation. Its mysteries live in the gray space between signal and silence. We listen and the echoes come back changed, delayed, scattered, but they come back. And that, in itself, is something miraculous. Because to send sound into the deep is to believe that the deep will answer. To ask again and again, and to build a picture out of what the water remembers. Not everything can be known. Not everything should be. But in these echoes we find fragments. Pieces of a map. A suggestion of what might be waiting beneath the shifting floor. The ocean does not give away its stories easily. But it doesn't keep them entirely hidden either. It speaks through pressure, through shadow, through sound. And when we are quiet enough, when we stop assuming and begin listening, we start to understand its strange language. A language of questions, of patterns without explanation, of structures that emerge half-formed on the edges of detection. And so we keep pinging, keep scanning, keep hoping that one day an echo will return not just as shape, but as understanding. Because if even the deepest silence sends something back, what else might be answering us, just too faint for us to recognize? What else might we already have heard, without knowing what it was trying to say? It begins with pixels, not dirt beneath fingernails or fragments pulled from stone, but data, digital depth measurements beamed from satellites or mapped by ships moving slowly across the sea. Bit by bit, ping by ping, the ocean skin is translated into something we can almost see. For most of history, the seafloor was a blank. A blue mystery on maps, marked only by numbers, depth estimates, vague contours, little arrows for current. We imagined it flat, unchanging, forgettable. But now we know better. Now we know that beneath the shimmer of the surface lies a world as complex, as violent, as sculpted as anything we see above. Seamounts rise like forgotten mountains, taller than any skyline. Abyssal plains stretch vast and silent, punctuated by trenches that seem to fall forever. Plateaus appear, broad, flat expanses that feel like land, though they've been underwater for millions of years. Some are massive. Some have coastlines. Some may have once been dry. Through multi-beam sonar, satellite altimetry, and high-resolution submersible scans, a ghost map begins to form. And with it, the possibility that what we lost is not entirely gone. Take Zealandia, for instance, a sunken continent long suspected, long dismissed. Hidden beneath the Southwest Pacific, its peaks are islands now. New Zealand, New Caledonia, and others. But the shape, the plateau beneath, the geological fingerprint, it matches what we'd expect of a continental crust. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A continent, 9/10 submerged. It rose once. It breathed air. And now it sleeps under the sea. Or look to the Mariana Trench, where tectonic forces bend the crust inward, folding it like paper. Around it, the Pacific seafloor ripples with features. Ridges, fractures, plate boundaries. Like scars from a long-forgotten trauma. We see them now not because we dove there, but because we scanned them. With sound, with light, with math. Each new image reveals something strange. A slope that's too even. A flat expanse that looks suspiciously like a plain. A shelf that might have once been a coast. In some cases, we find fossilized shorelines, coral that grew at sea level but now lies far beneath it. In others, we trace submerged riverbeds, channels carved when the land was dry, now buried under sediment and time. We are rediscovering Earth. But not in the way explorers once did, by walking into unknown lands. Now, we rediscover through synthesis, layering datasets, correcting distortions, teasing clarity from noise. And what we're finding feels familiar. There's something deeply human in the way we interpret these ghost lands. We overlay our lost stories on them. We see Atlantis in every symmetry, Lemuria in every submerged rise. But beyond the myth, there is something factual stirring. These are not fantasies. These are real shapes, real geography, the terrain of vanished time. Why do we care so much about land that is no longer ours to walk? Perhaps because it reminds us that the earth is alive, that it moves, that it forgets, that nothing is permanent, not even the ground beneath our feet. Coastlines shift, continents sink. What is dry today may drown tomorrow. And still, the traces remain. Digital terrain models render these lost places in glowing contours. Reds for shallow, blues for depth. We pan across the map as if flying, and suddenly, a structure appears. A ridge, a crater, a feature unnamed, unseen by human eyes, but now known again through numbers. What was once lost, in this way, becomes half-remembered. Even the deepest trenches, once thought lifeless and void, have begun to yield their topographies. Cameras dropped into the darkness reveal slopes and rock faces, soft sediment, the slow falling of marine snow, and on those slopes sometimes unusual features, blocks, terraces, forms that ask questions without offering answers. As the maps grow clearer, the ocean seems to recede not physically but mentally. The veil lifts. What we once called unknown becomes not yet known. What we once dismissed as abyss becomes artifact. Still, most of the sea remains unmapped. Still, the majority of Earth's underwater terrain waits in silence, unrendered, unseen. But every new scan, every dataset, every anomaly, draws the ghost lines closer to view. We are not just mapping what is there. We are mapping what was there, before the sea rose, before the plates shifted, before memory eroded into myth. And if this many lost topographies can return in pixels, how many more are still waiting in the dark? How many stories of stone are still sleeping just beyond the edge of resolution? We tend to believe that intelligence leaves a trace, that if something remarkable once lived here, something self-aware, organized, advanced, we would know. There would be walls, tools, scripts carved in stone. But what if we're only looking for echoes that resemble our own? What if something intelligent did rise before us, and chose not to build with permanence? The fossil record is deep but not complete. The crust of the earth is restless. Plates fold, seas rise, sediment swallows. In a few thousand years, even a city like ours' steel-glass circuitry can dissolve into dust. In a million years, it might be erased completely. In 10 million, the planet may carry no visible mark at all. So what happens if intelligence bloomed not a few thousand years ago, but a few million? This is not science fiction. This is a question being asked quietly, even by scientists. Could an earlier civilization have existed, pre-human or non-human, that lived and vanished long before we were here to remember? One that did not shape stone into statues. One that did not quarry mountains. One that did not leave monuments, but impressions? Not in objects. In chemistry, the Silurian hypothesis, proposed by researchers from NASA and elsewhere, invites us to consider the possibility of an industrial civilization in the distant past. Not to claim it happened, but to ask, if it did, how would we know? And the answer is unsettling. We might not. All signs point to the reality that Earth is good at forgetting, especially in the oceans, especially when memory is built of material meant to decay. We think of intelligence as builders, makers, engineers, But what if intelligence once flourished in a form that didn't require building at all? What if it was aquatic, fluid, ephemeral? What if it saw permanence as imbalance and lived within the flow of its world? What if its ruins were not cities but stories, never etched in stone, only passed in sound, light, movement, or perhaps it did build, but with biodegradable materials, with coral, with ice, with organic compounds that would never fossilize. Perhaps it developed energy sources we can no longer detect, systems that left no carbon, no waste, only subtle isotopic changes buried beneath miles of seabed. We search for evidence in the form of tools and bones. But the Earth, over hundreds of millions of years, has been scraped clean many times. Subduction zones consume crust. Oceans bury coastlines. The oldest seafloor is just 200 million years old, far younger than Earth's true age. Whatever came before, if it came, has already been rewritten. And yet, the gaps remain. In the fossil record, there are strange silences. Gaps in biodiversity, sudden climate shifts without clear cause, carbon spikes, mercury anomalies, layers of clay marking extinction but not what led to it. We explain them through volcanism, impacts, natural cycles. And maybe that's all they are. But maybe some are footprints too faded to name. If a civilization had risen in the Carboniferous period, say 300 million years ago, how would we find it? The continents were arranged differently then. The air was thick with oxygen. Forests towered with ferns and trees we no longer recognize. Could something conscious have shared that world? Could it have used its intelligence to live lightly, rather than leave a ruin? Maybe intelligence, if it existed, was not like ours. Maybe it did not expand, but deepen. Maybe it built only what it needed, then dismantled it. Maybe it left the world better, not worse. Maybe its greatness was in its lack of footprint. Or maybe it tried. Maybe it rose, fell, left signals we're only now beginning to recognize, carbon patterns, unusual sediment layers, chemical traces in ocean mud. Technofossils not shaped like skyscrapers or satellites, but like statistical anomalies. Like a moment of warmth before the freeze. What we call civilization may be just one expression of awareness. Not the only one. Not the first. And so we wonder, with quiet humility, if something lived before us and left nothing but altered strata, would we even know we were not alone in time? The stones do not speak of it. But maybe they once did. And if something intelligent once walked this planet and was forgotten by stone, then who or what might one day forget us the same way? Somewhere, deep beneath the ocean, lie the bones of a creature no one remembers. Not because it was unremarkable, but because it was alone in its dying. It left no trace in language, no record in art. It simply ended and the world moved on. And yet, for a time it breathed, felt the current, fed, reproduced, perhaps suffered, perhaps wondered. It lived a life that mattered entirely to itself. And now that life is gone, not just in form but in meaning. What becomes of a memory with no witness? We like to think that stories persist, that what once was will always be known, somewhere by someone. But Earth is old and the layers are deep. Most of what has happened here has already been forgotten. The species that lived and vanished before the first tree took root. The migrations across lands now drowned. The storms that shook the world long before we named wind. Even human stories, once spoken with reverence, fade without warning. A grandmother's lullaby, a ritual once performed every full moon. The name of a child who died too young to be recorded. There are entire civilizations whose words we cannot read. Not because they didn't write, but because no one remained to carry the key. Memory, it turns out, is fragile. It requires presence, repetition, witness, and when those vanish, memory does not die, but it unravels. What happens, then, to identity? What is a self, a people, a culture when no one recalls them? Does their meaning persist in the layers of the earth? Or only in the thin hope that someone, someday, will find the remnants and ask, "Who were you?" Geology remembers in structure, not story. in sediment, not sentiment. It captures the fact of a thing but not its feeling. A fossil tells us something lived, but not what it dreamed. A layer of ash tells us something burned, but not why it mattered. So much of what makes life beautiful, its songs, its rituals, its fears and joys, leaves no trace in rock, no chemical footprint, no stratigraphic marker. It vanishes the moment the last witness closes their eyes. And still, we live as though our stories are permanent. We write, we carve, we build. We name stars and streets and children in the hope that someone will remember. And perhaps they will, for a while. But time is long, and entropy does not weep. One day, there may be no one left who speaks our languages, who understands our machines, who knows that we ever existed. Our cities may crumble, our books may decay, even our satellites may drift too far to matter. And what then? Are we gone? Or simply unread? Perhaps memory is not about being remembered by others. Perhaps it is about being known fully in the moment of living. Perhaps that creature in the deep, forgotten by all, was no less real for having no legacy. Perhaps the story that ends without a witness is still a story, complete in its own silence. But still, the desire lingers, to be known, to be carried forward, to not dissolve entirely into the dark. Some believe the earth itself remembers, that its patterns, its rhythms, its changes carry the echo of everything that has ever been. That deep in the structure of the crust, in isotope trails and folded strata, something of us will remain, not just as matter, but as story waiting to be retold. Maybe memory does not vanish. Maybe it simply changes form. Maybe we are already stories embedded in the clay, waiting for hands that have not yet evolved to open us again. Or maybe we are like rain falling into the sea, distinct for a moment then gone. And yet, the sea is made of rain. If every life, every moment, every song forgotten still shape the world in some small way, then nothing is truly lost, just unspoken. And if a story has no witness, then perhaps the ocean becomes the witness, the keeper, the silent listener to everything we hoped would last. But if the ocean itself forgets, if even it lets go, then who or what will remember that we were ever here at all? There are rivers in the ocean, silent, invisible, vast. They do not flow along the surface, but through the body of the sea itself, weaving through its depths like breath through lungs. Cold, dense water sinks in the polar regions and begins a journey so slow it might take 1,000 years to return to where it began. This is the thermohaline circulation, sometimes called the global conveyor belt. It is not fast. It is not loud. But it remembers. These deep currents move not by force, but by difference, temperature and salt guiding their path. Thermohaline, warmth and salinity. Together, they drive a cycle that touches every corner of the ocean, drawing tropical heat toward the poles and pulling polar cold toward the equator. Without them, the planet would shiver unevenly. With them, the sea becomes a global memory loop, carrying warmth, nutrients, and something stranger still, the chemical imprint of time. As water sinks near Greenland or Antarctica, it traps within it the fingerprint of its surroundings. Temperature, dissolved gases, particles, traces of life. It then descends into the deep, where sunlight never reaches, and begins its slow migration. This journey is not measured in days or years, but in centuries. Water that sinks today may not surface again for hundreds of years, emerging in a different ocean, under a different sky, into a world that no longer remembers the moment it left. But the water remembers. Scientists have traced these deep flows by following chemical signatures, ratios of carbon, concentrations of chlorofluorocarbons, radiocarbon decay. They've found water in the Pacific that began its journey during the Age of Enlightenment. Water still making its way westward while steam engines were being built and revolutions were rising on land. Could this water carry more than heat? Could it carry memory? Not memory as we understand it, not thoughts, not images, but chemical memory. A trace of past atmospheres, the imprint of volcanic eruptions, the fingerprint of a forest burned long ago, its ashes dissolved in rainfall, carried down rivers, folded into the sea. Each molecule, each ion, a whisper of something that happened once and has not entirely disappeared. And perhaps even more, the residue of human presence. Plastic particles, microfibers, pharmaceutical fragments, even synthetic hormones, subtle, nearly undetectable but present, flowing now through the same deep loops. Not just biology, not just geology, but us, our chemical story joining the cycle. When we imagine time machines, we imagine moving through time with our bodies. But here, time moves through the world as water. Currents connecting centuries. Deep pathways crossing generations. A molecule of water may pass through ice, through the tropics, through the abyss, through the mouth of a whale. It might hold oxygen that once passed through the lungs of a mammoth, or dust from a comet's tail, or carbon exhaled by something now extinct. In this way, the ocean is not just space. It is duration. To dive into the deep is to encounter not just depth, but age. Some parts of the abyss are filled with water older than entire nations, older than the printing press, older than our idea of the world itself. And yet, they flow, carrying the past forward, unnoticed. And still, the system is fragile. Warming temperatures, melting ice, disrupted salinity, all threaten to slow or shift these ancient pathways. A pulse out of rhythm, a breath that catches. If the circulation falters, climates will tilt. Storms will wander. Fisheries will collapse. And time itself, in the form of memory-bearing water, will lose its way. We are altering the currents now, not with intention but by consequence. And so, we must ask, what will future water remember of us? Perhaps, somewhere deep beneath the South Atlantic, a body of water is just now beginning its journey, trapping the chemical breath of our century. Perhaps it will not surface again until long after we are gone. And when it does, when it rises in some far ocean in a changed world, what will that water say? Not in words, but in ratios, in anomalies, in quiet evidence. The sea does not forget. It flows. It waits. It returns. And if the ocean's currents are indeed like time machines, then maybe we are not just passengers. We are messages, waiting to be read by a world that does not yet exist. The ocean is never truly silent. It hums, murmurs, clicks. It groans with shifting tectonic plates, hisses with hydrothermal vents, echoes with the calls of whales stretching miles through salt and pressure. And yet, in some places, it falls quiet. Not empty, not dead, just quiet, so quiet that even the smallest sound becomes a presence. In these moments of stillness, between the rhythms of crashing waves or the long-range songs of creatures in the dark, the sea holds its breath. It listens, it waits, and something unnamed, lingers just beneath the silence. We measure sound underwater in decibels and frequencies, but sound is more than number. It's motion, it's memory, a vibration that carries the shape of something unseen. In the deep ocean, sound travels faster and farther than in air. Curves with temperature, bends with salinity. Some frequencies dive into the depths, bouncing from the seabed to the surface again and again, carrying their message across whole oceans. But then there are the zones where sound goes to hide. At a certain depth, around 1,000 meters down, there exists what scientists call the SOFAR channel, the sound fixing and ranging layer. Here, temperature and pressure combine in such a way that sound slows and becomes trapped, traveling horizontally with incredible efficiency. A whale song sung in this layer can echo for hundreds of miles. A single low-frequency ping from a submarine can span a hemisphere. But in this very same layer, there is also quiet, a hushed corridor, a zone where natural sounds thin out, where mechanical interference fades, where the noise of the surface does not reach, and the weight of the deep absorbs all but the longest, loneliest voices. And so, we send instruments into this hush. Hydrophones, listening buoys, arrays strung across the seafloor like invisible ears, waiting for something to break the silence. And sometimes, something does. The ocean, vast and unmapped, is full of unexplained sounds. The bloop, the upsweep, the slowdown, Strange low-frequency noises captured by hydrophones, rising or falling, mechanical yet organic, repeating yet unresolved. Some have been traced to icebergs, tectonic shifts, or undersea landslides. Others remain mysteries. No coordinates, no cause, only sound, fading into silence. These anomalies raise no alarm. They do not scream. They murmur. They pulse softly at the edges of comprehension, like forgotten languages spoken in dreams. And always after them comes the quiet again. It is easy to imagine the silence of the ocean as absence. But perhaps it is the opposite. Perhaps silence is the truest presence of all, the ocean's own voice when it chooses not to speak. A lull not of vacancy, but of intention. For millions of years, creatures have evolved to hear underwater. Fish with pressure-sensitive organs. Whales with complex vocal patterns. Even the tiniest shrimp can snap their claws to communicate or defend. But beyond biology, perhaps the ocean holds deeper silences. Ancient silences, ones that have nothing to do with life as we know it. Could it be that there are forms of memory in the water that do not vibrate through air, but through stillness? Could the quiet between waves be a kind of language too slow, too wide, too soft for us to decode? We search for life by listening. But perhaps the life that matters most no longer makes noise. Or perhaps it never did. Perhaps it moved in ways that needed no echo. And so we keep listening to the gaps, the moments between calls, the places where instruments detect nothing. Because even nothing is something when it arrives where there should be sound. Maybe silence is what's left after time forgets the sound. Maybe it's the echo of civilizations too old to trace. Or maybe it's simply the earth at rest, holding still for a while, breathing quietly through currents and gravity. Either way, there is meaning in the hush, because in every stillness, something waits. And if sound carries story, then perhaps silence carries the space for stories not yet told. Stories too deep, too soft, too ancient to be loud. But if even silence holds presence, what else might we be hearing without even knowing it? From space, our cities gleam, lights pulsing across continents, roads threading through the dark like veins. Satellites blink, towers rise. We tell ourselves this is permanence, that what we've built will endure. And yet, in the language of geology, we are only a flicker, a brief anomaly etched in the topmost sediment of time. But even flickers leave residue. The technofossil hypothesis is a way of asking, if a future intelligence, human or otherwise, were to study the Earth 100 million years from now, what would it find of us? What would we leave behind? Would we be remembered? Or would we be a layer misread? Or missed altogether? Technofossils are not bones or shells or natural impressions. They are the strange new artifacts we've introduced to the planet: plastics, alloys, concrete, synthetic chemicals, radioactive isotopes, carbon spikes. These are the unnatural residues of our age, the byproducts of cities, of combustion, of industry. In time, they will settle into rivers, into lakes, into oceans, and finally into stone. And if they survive deep time, they may become the only evidence that we ever existed. Imagine a core sample taken far in the future. The layer for our age might be barely a centimeter thick, compressed between ancient mud and what comes after us. And in that layer, the signature would be unmistakable. An abrupt spike in carbon, a scattering of microplastics, the sheen of metals that never occur in nature. There might be remnants of rubber, fiberglass, traces of nitrogen from fertilizer runoff. And maybe, just maybe, a fossil of something manufactured, a tire fragment, a shard of polymer, a silicon chip fused into rock. But would these artifacts tell our story? Would they speak of who we were? Or would they simply suggest something happened? Because time transforms everything. What we call a skyscraper may become a buried mineral anomaly. What we see as infrastructure may fracture and dissolve. Concrete we thought eternal may crumble under water and root. Books, buildings, even language, if left without care, can disappear in centuries. What endures are not our intentions, but our residue. And residue, misunderstood, becomes myth. Consider the idea that future beings might misinterpret our fossil record entirely. That they may find only fragments, enough to know something unusual occurred, but not enough to understand us. A sudden extinction, planetary pulse, a layer of disturbance, but no context, no narrative, no names, or worse, they might find nothing at all, because most of our civilization is built on surfaces, on coastal plains, on riverbanks, on lowlands that, geologically speaking, are temporary. Sea levels rise, earthquakes shift, cities fall into rivers, into bays, into silence. The ocean is a patient editor. It erases well, and if our story ends in subduction, if our ruins are pulled into the mantle, melted, reformed, then even the strange materials we invented may vanish. Not by neglect, but by planetary design. The Earth recycles. Even memory. But some signals might remain. There are radioactive isotopes, traces from nuclear tests and power, now embedded in glaciers, in lakebeds, in the bones of marine life. There are plastics so durable they may persist for millennia, perhaps even longer in the absence of light and oxygen. There are artificial minerals, metamaterials created in labs, that may confuse future geologists, unable to trace their origin in natural processes. To us, these are contaminants. To others, they may be clues. But what if they find more? What if they uncover a structure, preserved by chance, buried beneath a landslide, sealed in an anoxic trench? Would they understand it was built? Would they know it was inhabited? Would they imagine who we were? Or would they ask the same questions we now ask of those who may have come before us? What we call civilization is really a conversation with time. It is the attempt to outlast ourselves, to leave a mark, a shape, a whisper. But the Earth does not guarantee remembrance. It offers no promise that one era will be known to the next. The technofossil hypothesis is not just a theory. It is a mirror. It asks us to consider how fragile even our loudest achievements truly are. We may be the most detectable species the planet has produced. But detection is not understanding. And memory, without context, fades into artifact. And so we wonder, what will we become? A line in rock? A chemical scar? A mystery waiting to be solved? And if all that remains of us is a whisper in stone, will it be enough to say that we were here? Or will we, too, become a civilization forgotten by stone, folded into the layers, waiting for someone someday to wonder? The ocean does not forget the air. Every breath the planet takes, every change in temperature, every rise in carbon, eventually the sea feels it. It absorbs, it reacts, it remembers. And buried deep within its coldest sediments, locked in layers of mud and shell, lies a quiet, sprawling diary. A climate record written in chemistry, not words. The ocean's carbon diary is not stored in sentences, but in ratios, in microscopic shells, in the chemistry of ancient seawater captured long ago and slowly tucked beneath the seabed. It is not easy to read. It is not meant to be. But if we listen, it speaks of warmth and freeze, extinction and bloom. It speaks of change, slow, cyclical, sometimes sudden, and the breath of the planet over time. The storytellers are tiny. Foraminifera, single-celled plankton with delicate, spiraled shells, drift through the upper ocean, living short lives and then sinking when they die. Over millions of years, their remains accumulate like dust, layer upon layer, each one reflecting the chemistry of the water at the moment it lived. Their calcium carbonate shells capture the ratio of oxygen isotopes in the water, particularly the balance between oxygen-16 and oxygen-18. That ratio changes with climate. During ice ages, lighter isotopes are locked away in glaciers, and the oceans become slightly heavier. During warm periods, the ice melts, the isotopes redistribute. The foraminifera record it all. So when scientists retrieve sediment cores from the seafloor, they are pulling up rings of memory, each layer a snapshot of the Earth's climate, layer by layer, century by century, stretching back millions of years. But the diary doesn't end with foraminifera. Deeper in the cores, we find changes in carbon content, spikes of carbon-13 and carbon-12, Shifts that trace the breathing of forests, the burning of biomass, the activity of volcanoes, the stirring of oceans. Carbon doesn't just move through air and land, it flows through the sea. The ocean holds 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. A massive, pulsing reservoir that exchanges gas at the surface, absorbs what we exhale, and tucks it away in cold currents and sediment. Sometimes the balance shifts slowly. Other times it changes fast. In the geological record, there are layers, thin and sharp, where the carbon spikes unnaturally. One of them marks the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, around 56 million years ago. A moment when the planet warmed rapidly. Carbon levels soared. Oceans acidified. Species vanished. The layer is still there, faint but unmistakable. A warning written in silt. We are now writing another one. Modern ice cores taken from beneath polar seas also hold clues. Trapped bubbles of air, preserved in ancient snow, show the changing concentration of CO2 over hundreds of thousands of years. The pattern has always been cyclical, glacial and interglacial rhythms, breathing in and out over time. Until now, in the last 2 centuries, the carbon levels have risen faster than any natural cycle on record. And the ocean, faithful as ever, is recording it. The surface waters absorb more CO2, which alters the pH, which stresses marine life. Shells become thinner. Coral reefs bleach. The chemistry shifts, and with it, the entire balance of life. The foraminifera still fall. The carbon still settles. The diary continues. But the story has changed. What's striking is not just what the ocean records, but how long it keeps the memory. Long after we are gone, the carbon we've emitted will remain stored in sediment, in isotope ratios, in the altered shells of plankton. The future will read our age not by our monuments, but by our molecules. And what will they find? A spike, a distortion, a sudden change in the pattern unlike anything that came before. A dark line in the core, whispering of combustion, of change, of us. In that way, we are not outside of nature. We are part of the diary now. Our story, our industry, our choices, pressed into the same mud as ancient algae and ammonites. And so the ocean continues to write. Not with judgment, not with sorrow, simply with fidelity. Recording, as it always has, the memory of Earth's breath. And if we are careful, if we are humble, we might still have time to decide what the next chapter says. But if the diary is already written, what kind of story will the ocean tell about this moment, when we knew we were part of the record, and still turned the page? Beneath the cold silence of the seafloor, there is fire. It pulses unseen, not with the flicker of flame, but with pressure, with heat, with molten force. Down in the darkness, along fracture lines and tectonic seams, the earth breathes fire into water, and with each exhale it rewrites the story above it. We often imagine the ocean as a passive memory keeper, layering silt, trapping bones, preserving what falls. But sometimes it burns its own pages. The undersea volcano is not just a force of creation or destruction. It is a paradox, both a writer and an eraser of time. Along mid-ocean ridges and subduction zones, magma rises. It seeps and surges, cracking through crust, shaping new land beneath miles of pressure. Lava cools in strange ways underwater, pillowing, bubbling, forming glassy black structures that seem almost alien. These eruptions build new floors, push continents, and forge mountain ranges taller than Everest, entirely out of sight. But what they create, they also bury. When an underwater volcano erupts, it can swallow everything in its path. Coral reefs, fossil beds, ancient sediments layered with time, all gone. Sealed beneath fresh basalt, erased as if they never were. The fire makes no distinction. It does not care what is lost. It simply flows. And yet, in its destruction, it sometimes preserves. There are places where lava flows have encapsulated entire structures, fossilizing them in place. Where ash clouds settled softly over seafloor plains, sealing them in time. Where hydrothermal vents, the strange chimneys of the deep, pour mineral-rich fluids into the cold dark and create new life. Life that might fossilize in ways we do not yet understand. These vents are born from the same fire that melts memory. They hiss and shimmer in the abyss, releasing heat and metals, forming towers of black and white that grow like underwater cathedrals. Around them, life gathers: bacteria, worms, crabs, creatures without eyes, evolved to survive in the chemistry of the deep. Entire ecosystems, independent of sunlight, pulsing with ancient energy. These too are fragile. A vent can go dormant. A shift in the crust can silence it. Then the life vanishes, the tower crumbles, and what remains is left to silt or to stone. In some ways, the ocean's volcanic zones are like palimpsests, parchments rewritten, histories layered atop one another. Undersea eruptions do not start with blank slates. They overwrite. They intrude into existing terrain. And in doing so, they blend memory with erasure, making it harder to decipher what came before. Still, we search. Submersibles lower cameras into volcanic calderas. Remote-operated vehicles skim the crust for heat signatures. Seismic instruments detect the faint rumblings of magma on the move. And geologists drill into ancient lava flows, hoping to find what they obscured: traces of older Earth, fossilized beneath the fire. What we found is strange. In some places, volcanic layers contain fossils scorched but intact, microbes sealed in glass. In others, we find gaps, blank zones in the record where we know something lived, but all that remains is cooled basalt and silence. Volcanoes do not merely destroy or preserve. They do both. And the sea, with its pressure and darkness, amplifies this duality. What should melt may be protected. What should survive may be erased. The line is never clear. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson. That memory is not linear. That preservation is not guaranteed. That even fire can forget. Still, every eruption leaves a signature. A chemical fingerprint in the ocean's chemistry. An isotope ratio in marine sediment. A layer of ash deposited far from its source. These are the footnotes of undersea fire. And they remind us, even the things that burn leave behind a shadow. So we follow the shadows. We map the scars. We try to understand what this churning heat is telling us. Because somewhere beneath the basalt, beneath the cooled flows and shattered towers, there may still be stories waiting. Stories of what lived, of what was lost, of what was changed. And if what burns below also erases, then what does it mean to remember in a place shaped by forgetting? Light falls only so far. Even on the brightest days, when the sky is clear and the waves shimmer like liquid mirrors, sunlight can only reach the ocean's skin. 100 meters down, and the colors begin to fade. Reds vanish first, then oranges, then greens. By 200 meters, only blue remains, flickering faintly like memory. And then darkness. Beyond that point, more than 2/3 of the ocean lies in eternal night. The Hadal Zone, named for Hades, the underworld of Greek mythology, begins around 6,000 meters below the surface. It is a place of trenches and crushing pressure, where the weight of 7 miles of water presses down with the force of mountains. It is the deepest region of the sea, a realm so distant from sunlight that photosynthesis has never happened there. Life, if it exists, finds other ways to survive. Or it has died quietly, entombed in mud before we ever knew it lived, and we've barely touched it. In the vast history of exploration, only a few human-made vessels have ever reached the deepest ocean trenches. Most of what we know comes from remote instruments, from occasional samplings, from sonar scans that translate shape into shadow. The rest is speculation, quiet, humbling speculation, because if life evolved here, if something bloomed in this pressure-cooked silence, it would not look like anything we've seen. It would not need eyes. It would not need warmth. It would not rely on the sun, the sky, the seasons. It would belong entirely to the deep. Already we've discovered creatures that defy expectation. Amphipods with translucent shells. Ghostly snailfish that drift like loose thoughts. Microbes that feed on methane and sulfur, thriving in chemical reactions alone. These life forms don't depend on light. They depend on minerals, on ancient processes of decay, on the faint remnants of organic matter that drift down from above, what scientists call marine snow. But what of fossils? Fossilization in the hadal zones is rare, but not impossible. The conditions are extreme yet stable. Cold, oxygen poor, slow to change. In some areas, an organism that dies may be covered quickly by fine sediment, shielded from scavengers and bacteria. With time, it could mineralize. With enough time, it could be preserved. But we don't know what lies beneath those sediments. We don't know how much has died there, or how long it's been waiting. In the deepest parts of the ocean, geology moves differently. Tectonic plates bend into trenches, pulling crust down into the mantle. These subduction zones are among the most dynamic places on Earth. But they are also some of the least explored. What has been swallowed there? What stories lie folded into the folds of rock? Could entire biomes have risen and fallen in the deep, unnoticed? Could ancient life older than the continents, have left behind fossil records that remain untouched, simply because we have not yet dared to look? The hadal zone is not empty. It is vast, complex, layered with cliffs, ridges, and plains we have yet to name. It is a world without sky, without horizon, without dawn. And yet it is not without history. What if some version of intelligence, slow-moving and deep-dwelling, once emerged here, never needing surface, never needing sun? What if it built not with stone, but with vibration, with current, with chemical gradient? What if it left no ruins, only traces in biology, in isotope ratios, in subtle deviations buried far beneath what we have measured? Would we recognize it? Or would we pass over it, blind in our brightness? Even now, we send sound into the depths, waiting for echoes. We drop cameras into the trenches, searching for flickers of movement. But most of the hadal zones remain untouched, unexplored, unread. They are the planet's black pages, chapters not missing, but sealed. And perhaps that's where the oldest stories are. Because light does not define life. Visibility does not guarantee knowing. And silence is not always the same as absence. What has lived in the darkness might still be there. What has died there may be better preserved than anything we've ever found on land. And what has never known sunlight may still remember something we've long since forgotten. But if we have barely begun to see what lives in the dark, how much deeper must we go to learn what has already died there? The ocean watches the sky. It reflects it by day, mirrors it by night, holding stars in its shifting surface. But sometimes the sky does more than shimmer overhead. Sometimes it falls, and when it falls, it leaves a wound. We often imagine meteors striking land, craters, shock waves, walls of dust. But more often, the impact is swallowed by the sea. After all, the ocean covers most of Earth's surface. And so, when the sky descends in fire, it does so not always with a blast we can study, but with a plunge we can barely trace. Yet even here, in the ocean's deepest dark, the stars leave scars. 66 million years ago, a meteor roughly the size of a mountain crashed into shallow waters near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The Chicxulub impact, the moment that ended the age of dinosaurs. The force released was unimaginable. Earthquakes, tsunamis, wildfires, and a dust veil that blanketed the skies. Life across the globe changed in an instant, and though the crater lies buried under land now, it began beneath the sea. This wasn't the only one. Scientists believe that over Earth's long story, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of significant celestial objects have collided with our planet. Many struck the oceans, vanishing into water, their evidence scattered or lost. But not entirely. The ocean remembers, even when it buries the memory. We find the clues in unusual places. In layers of iridium, a rare element common in asteroids but rare on Earth. In shocked quartz, glassy grains shaped by unimaginable pressure. In sediment cores, where a fine line of ash and soot tells of a day when something vast came from above. These are the fingerprints of drowned stars. Sometimes the impacts are small, creating microtectites, tiny glass droplets scattered across the seabed. Other times, they reshape coastlines, shift tectonics, or launch waves that travel across entire oceans, rewriting shorelines in a single surge. What we now call a peaceful bay may once have been the rim of a crater. What we call a trench may have deepened in the wake of skyfall. There is a strange intimacy in it. Sky meeting sea, heat meeting cold. The ancient fire of space colliding with Earth's most fluid memory. The stars do not ask permission. They arrive suddenly, rewrite history, and vanish beneath the waves. And sometimes, we find their remnants long after we've forgotten their arrival. In 2018, researchers discovered a layer of microscopic spherules buried in the seafloor, hinting at an ocean impact some 12,000 years ago. Perhaps one that coincided with sudden climate shifts, flooding, and the rapid disappearance of megafauna. No crater has been confirmed. No definitive answer found. But the trace is there. A whisper, a disruption in the pattern. Could the myths of floods, fire from the sky, and lost worlds be memories of these celestial events? Retold through generations, abstracted into story? Perhaps. Or perhaps these are separate truths, converging. What we know is this: the ocean is not just a passive receiver. When something falls into it, it responds. It records. It folds the moment into chemistry and sediment. And sometimes what it receives changes everything: temperature, atmosphere, life. But like all memories in motion, the evidence drifts. Tsunamis erase shorelines. Craters collapse. Sediment covers the scars. The impact becomes a layer, then a pattern, then a mystery. Only through deep drilling, isotope analysis, and long decoding do we begin to piece together what the ocean has hidden. And still, how many have we missed? How many events struck in deep waters, far from land, their signals dispersed into trenches too deep to probe, or subducted into the mantle before we ever began to look? What if some of our extinction events, some of our strange, sudden shifts were not from within but from above? And if so, are we next? Another fragment of the sky may already be traveling toward us, on a timeline far beyond our attention. Could arrive tomorrow, or in 1,000,000 years, or not at all. But history suggests the sky falls more often than we care to admit. And when it does, the ocean will be waiting, ready to receive, to absorb, to remember. Because water does not forget the stars. And if the ocean holds the memory of drowned continents, of ancient tides, of vanished species and buried cities, then it also holds the remnants of the sky's fury. Perhaps the stars have fallen many times. Perhaps they will fall again. And perhaps the only place where their story still lingers is in the silence of the sea, where no light ever reaches and no witness remains. But if even the stars can drown, then what else might lie buried, not by time but by impact, still sending its ripples outward, too deep for us to feel? Yet, the earth speaks in movements, not with voice, but with pressure, not with sentences, but with shifts beneath our feet, slow, grinding, sometimes sudden. And in the places where its skin cracks open, where one plate meets another, the planet whispers stories few have heard. These are the fault lines. They lie hidden beneath oceans and mountains, where the crust folds in on itself. They are not just lines, but thresholds, boundaries where memory changes form, where one world is pushed beneath another, where continents vanish not in fire, but in silence. The sea is full of these quiet seams. Subduction zones, the deep, sloping trenches where one tectonic plate dives beneath another, are among the most mysterious places on Earth. They do not shout. They do not rise. They sink, pulling rock, sediment, fossils, even ancient coastlines downward, deep into the mantle. Down there, in the heat and pressure, time is melted, reshaped, erased. But before it disappears, it murmurs. Seismologists listen for these murmurs. They place instruments on the seafloor to detect microquakes. Small slips, faint trembles, the groaning of a planet under tension. These are not the dramatic ruptures we fear. These are the whispers, the signals of stress building, of rock adjusting, of layers folding over one another like pages in a book too old to stay open. Each fault line carries history, literally. As the plates move, they transport sediment laid down over eons. They tuck away the past into darkness. A river delta buried, a reef crushed, a fossil bed folded into stone. Memory doesn't disappear. It descends. And what descends is not always lost. Sometimes, remnants return. A marine fossil found on a mountain. A folded rock layer far inland, shaped by pressure that began in the ocean trench. These are tectonic echoes, evidence of memory being transported, reshaped, lifted again. But not all memories survive the journey. Subduction consumes. At certain depths, minerals melt. Rocks flow like heavy syrup. The ancient becomes molten, part of the mantle's slow churn. And what was once land, once surface, once known, becomes indistinguishable. In this way, the planet keeps no permanent archive. It recycles even its own record. Still, we trace the edges. Fault zones aren't just geological features, they're boundaries of understanding. Lines that divide the known from the hidden. Above them, islands form. Volcanoes rise. Earthquakes shudder through the sea. And beneath them, vast slabs of crust sink into the unknown. In places like the Mariana Trench, the subduction is ancient. Millions of years of seafloor have been pulled under 1 centimeter at a time. Each centimeter 1,000 years. Each slab a lost world. And still it continues. The trench deepens. The whispers persist. Could something be hidden in those folds? Some fragment of a drowned land? Some fossil untouched by erosion? Maybe even the ruins of something built long ago, now broken, flattened, and carried away? We don't know. We drop sensors. We measure heat flow. We model the subduction process in labs. But the depths are vast, and the descent is slow. It may take tens of millions of years for something to be fully consumed. And in that time, it might lie undisturbed, held in pressure, held in quiet, beneath miles of crust and salt. The fault lines do not care for stories, but they carry them anyway. They are the movers of memory, the shifting shelves that decide what remains and what is lost. And sometimes they give something back. After a great quake, the seabed may lift. A piece of drowned shelf may rise above the waves for the first time in 10,000 years. We call it land. But it is something older, something returned. Perhaps memory is never truly erased. Perhaps it's only buried, waiting for the right moment to surface. And so we listen to the creaks, to the groans, to the pauses between quakes. Because in those silences, in those imperceptible shifts, the planet speaks of things we once were, and of places we no longer see. Tectonic edges are not just borders. They are time machines in motion. They fold the present into the past, and pull the past into heat. And if the earth has a voice, maybe it sounds like stone under tension. Maybe it sounds like pressure slowly releasing. Maybe it sounds like a whisper beneath the sea. But if these fault lines are always moving, always carrying memory away, how much of ourselves are we losing? 1 silent centimeter at a time? The sea feels eternal. Its rhythm, its tides, its breath against the shore. It all feels timeless, as if it has always been this way, as if the ocean, vast and blue and beyond reach, is the one part of the world that never truly changes. But that is the myth, because even the ocean forgets what it once was. Beneath the surface lies not constancy, but transformation. Beneath the waves, coastlines shift, depths reconfigure, entire ecosystems bloom and vanish. The ocean is not still water. It is living memory, rewritten with every passing age. There was a time when the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, quiet and enclosed. Then suddenly the Mediterranean breached its walls. Salt water rushed in, ecosystems collapsed, coastlines drowned. What had been stable for millennia changed in days. There was a time when the Sahara held rivers that flowed into the Atlantic. When northern Europe was one with the seafloor we now call Doggerland. When coral reefs grew where now there is only cold. Even now, the ocean is not fixed. Sea levels rise. Not evenly, but restlessly, like breath caught in the chest. Warming waters expand. Ice melts into the deep. Cities begin to redraw their boundaries, not by war, but by tide. What once was shore becomes seabed. What once was harbor becomes memory. And beneath these changes lies an older, deeper truth. The ocean basins themselves are not permanent. The Pacific is shrinking. The Atlantic is growing. The floor of the sea is born at ridges and consumed at trenches. Ocean crust is young compared to continents. It forms, it spreads, it dives back into the mantle. Even the shape of the deep is impermanent. We have not lived long enough to feel this shift. But the planet has. The scars are everywhere. In mid-ocean ridges that stretch like stitches. In ancient seamounts that once stood tall and now lie buried. In sediments that whisper of tropical species found in places now frigid. And yet, we still imagine the sea as a boundary. We draw maps with confident lines, as though the ocean respects the borders we assign it. But the sea does not listen. It moves where it will. It carries coastlines away grain by grain. It gives back land in one era and swallows it whole in the next. What we think of as a permanent feature, an island, a bay, a reef, is often just a pause in a long, shifting breath. Even ecosystems forget themselves. Coral reefs bleach and crumble. Kelp forests recede. Upwelling zones, places where nutrient-rich waters once surged, begin to weaken. Species migrate, chasing cooler waters. Some disappear altogether. The balance tilts, and the memory of what once thrived fades. And beneath it all, time writes its record. The sediment layers build, one atop the other, each telling of a different ocean. An ocean warmer or colder, more acidic or more vibrant. An ocean with different tides, different salt, different life. The only constant is the change itself. And still we believe in the myth. Still we return to the shore and say, it looks the same. But we are only seeing the surface. Beneath the waves, continents shift. Ecosystems rewire. Basins deepen. Nothing stays. Not even the silence. This is not a story of loss, but of transformation. The sea, like the sky, like the land, is shaped by time. It is not the stillness of eternity. It is the rhythm of forgetting and becoming. And maybe that's what makes it beautiful. To know that even the ocean, with all its depth, all its power, all its patience, is still in motion, still evolving, still writing its story across the skin of the earth. And if the ocean forgets what it once was, then how much of our own history, our own memory, is already buried beneath that quiet surface, changed not by catastrophe but simply by time. What else have we mistaken for permanence, when it was only passing through? In the deepest reaches of the sea, where sunlight never arrives and pressure turns silence into weight, there are lights that should not be. Tiny flickers, pulsing glows, blue-green pulses in total darkness. These are not machines. They are alive. Bioluminescent creatures, jellyfish, squid, plankton, worms, fish with lanterns where eyes might be. They drift and flicker in a kind of biological starlight, illuminating nothing, revealing little, but refusing to go unseen. They do not need the sun to shine. They have remembered something older, something inward. It is tempting to see this light as an adaptation, as camouflage, as lure, as language. And in many ways it is. But it is also something else, something deeper, a kind of memory, a code passed from ancestor to ancestor, unchanged across eras. The ability to make light without flame, without heat, held in the body like a secret. Where geology remembers through stone and sediment, biology remembers through continuity, through DNA, through traits preserved in the spiral of life. And in the ocean's deepest, darkest zones, where the Earth's fossil record is distorted or lost, these glowing organisms may carry histories that stone could never hold. Some species of deep-sea creatures have remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Ancient lineages, living fossils, blinking slowly in places no light has ever touched. Their shapes recall a time before continents split, before mammals rose, before forests bloomed on land. In their genomes, there may be memories of eras long erased from the surface. Could this be another form of archive? Could evolution, in its own drifting way, preserve the imprints of ancient environments, chemical patterns, metabolic strategies, immune responses, carried silently through eons? What if the glow itself is a kind of ancestral echo? Bioluminescence appears in many forms, across countless species. It has evolved not once, but dozens of times. Independent origins, parallel stories, yet always the same result: light from life, a soft defiance of darkness, a function so improbable, and yet so widespread, that it raises questions still unanswered. Why does so much of the ocean glow? Maybe because, in a place where nothing can be seen, to be seen is survival. Or maybe to glow is to remember that light once mattered. To carry a spark of the sun even where the sun cannot follow. Some researchers have begun to study the genes responsible for these lights. Luciferins, luciferases, biochemical pathways passed down for millennia. And in mapping these genes, they find clues not just to how organisms glow, but to when the trait first appeared. Some date back to the Cambrian, others older still, long before humans, long before even complex ecosystems as we know them. And yet here they are, still glowing, as if the ocean remembers in flickers. In some regions, entire clouds of plankton glow when disturbed, light swirling in the wake of a swimmer, a ship, a wave. A billion single-celled organisms responding as one, lighting up the sea in ghostly blue. Some call it magic. Others call it a chemical response. But beneath either label lies wonder. This glow is not just a reaction. It is a form of presence, of being counted, of saying, I was here. Even in darkness, something speaks. And what speaks may speak from deep time, from ancestors whose fossils will never be found, from environments long vanished, whose only memory now pulses in the bell of a jellyfish, in the spiral of a fish that lights its own path through the void. Perhaps what geology forgets, biology carries forward. Not in sentences, not in structure, but in pulse, in rhythm, in glow. A language without sound. A story told through generations of light. And if we learn to read this kind of memory, not in bones but in genes, not in strata but in signals, we may find that life itself is a living archive. That the ocean, in all its darkness, never stopped remembering. It just remembers differently. Somewhere, a light blinks, a signal without an audience, or perhaps an invitation. Because if even microbes glow, if even plankton shimmer in the dark, then perhaps the sea has never been silent at all. Perhaps it has been speaking in bioluminescent memory all along. But if memory can shine without being seen, what else has been glowing in the deep, waiting patiently for us to notice? The ocean breathes, though not in the way we do. It does not inhale through lungs or exhale through mouth. It breathes through currents, through chemistry, through cycles of oxygen and carbon and temperature that pulse across millennia. But sometimes, that breath falters. Sometimes the ocean holds its breath for too long, and life forgets how to return. These are the moments of extinction. They do not always come with fire or flood. Sometimes they come with stillness, with warming waters, with an invisible shift in the air. Sometimes what kills is not a force but the slow unraveling of balance, the sea's breath changing shape. In the long story of Earth, there have been at least 5 great extinctions, events so vast, so final, they reshaped the course of life itself. And many of them began not on land, but in the sea. During the Permian-Triassic extinction, some 252 million years ago, the oceans turned toxic. Volcanic eruptions flooded the skies with CO2. Temperatures spiked. Oxygen levels plummeted. Over 90 of marine species vanished. Coral reefs collapsed. Shells dissolved. The sea, once the cradle of life, became unbreathable. And yet, the ocean did not die. It changed. It rewrote itself. Slowly, each extinction left behind more than silence. It left a pattern, a chemical fingerprint, layers of black shale, rich in organic carbon, marking the moment when oxygen left the water column. These are known as oceanic anoxic events, spans of time when vast portions of the sea became suffocating, unable to support most complex life. When the breath of the ocean turned inward, we read these events in the strata now, in the carbon isotopes, in the ratios of sulfur and iron, in the sudden absence of certain fossils, and the brief bloom of others. Organisms adapted to thrive in chaos, in collapse, in the stillness after the wave. They are gone now, but their echo remains. Because extinction is not a singular moment. It ripples. It arrives in pulses, in waves, in quiet tipping points. Sometimes gradual, sometimes abrupt. A change in pH, a degree of warming, a slowing of the deep ocean conveyor belt. And then, one by one, the pillars of life begin to fall. Today, we see those signs again. The oceans are warming, acidifying, losing oxygen. Zones of low oxygen, called dead zones, have multiplied near coasts. Coral reefs bleach, then crumble. Species shift their ranges, chasing cooler waters that shrink by the year. Plankton, the base of the food web, show signs of stress in both size and abundance. And all of it whispers back to earlier endings. Not because we are reliving the past exactly, but because the ocean has been here before. It remembers what happens when balance is lost. And it is beginning to sigh once more. Some scientists call what we're living through the sixth extinction. Others caution that it's still unfolding, that we don't yet know how far the ripple will travel. But the signs are accumulating. Not in catastrophe but in trend. Not in flame but in breath. And perhaps that's what makes this moment so unsettling. We can feel the shape of something vast beginning to shift beneath us, but we don't yet know how loud its silence will become. Still, even in the record of extinctions, there is a strange kind of hope. Because every time the ocean has forgotten how to breathe, it has eventually remembered. New life has emerged. Strange, adapted, resilient. Entire ecosystems have reassembled from the ruins. It is not the same. It is never the same. But it is life, pulsing again in dark water. And we are part of that breath now. Our actions shape the carbon cycle. Our emissions shape the currents. Our choices press into the sediment. One day someone or something might read our moment in the core of a seafloor sample. They might find our layer, a line of altered isotopes, synthetic materials, and vanished species. And they might ask, what happened here? Was it just another ripple in a long pattern of collapse and renewal? Or was it something else? Something that could have been different? The breath of extinction is not always a scream. Sometimes it is a slow exhale, a thinning, a forgetting. But if we are listening, if we hear the sigh in time, perhaps we do not have to follow the pattern. Perhaps we can remember, even as the sea forgets. But if extinction still echoes from the deepest layers of stone, how far will our echo carry when the ocean breathes us in and lets us go? Atlantis is only the most famous. We speak its name as if it stands alone. A singular myth of a city lost to the sea, dreamed by philosophers, embellished by mystics, dismissed by scientists. But listen more closely, and you'll hear the same story told across the world. Different names, different gods, different coastlines, but always the water rises, the land disappears, and the memory is carried in silence. In the dialogues of Plato, Atlantis was vast, powerful, rich with technology and knowledge, until it vanished in a single day and night of misfortune. We call it allegory. We call it metaphor. But what if it is something older? What if it is not a fiction, but a memory too deep for dates? Because Plato was not the only one speaking of drowned lands. In India, ancient Sanskrit texts tell of Dvarka, a city ruled by the god Krishna, swallowed by the sea after his departure. Divers near the coast of modern-day Gujarat have found stone formations, pottery, roads now submerged beneath layers of silt. Some say it's natural, others that it is proof of something remembered. In the Pacific, Polynesian oral histories speak of lands that once lay between islands, now missing. In Hawaii, they sing of Kanehunamoku, the hidden land beneath the sea. In the islands of Micronesia, megalithic structures stand on isolated atolls, their purpose forgotten, their origin whispered across generations. In the North Sea, fishermen have pulled up bones, antlers, and tools, remnants of Doggerland, a vanished landscape that once connected Britain to Europe. Lush with rivers and forests, it was drowned as sea levels rose after the last ice age. There were no cities there, no written words, but perhaps there were fires, footsteps, Songs will never recover. And in the Americas, stories persist of ancient floods that reshaped the earth. From the Maya to the Inuit, from the Andes to the Mississippi, the memory repeats. The waters came and the world before was lost. What if these myths are not inventions, but inheritances? We treat myths as fiction, forgetting that for most of human history, memory lived in story, passed from voice to voice, carried in verse, protected not by stone, but by repetition. What was too vast to measure, what was too painful to explain, became parable, became warning. A flood may not always mean punishment. It may simply mean loss. A city sinking may not always mean hubris. It may mean mourning. Perhaps all these tales are not separate events, but one shared experience, remembered in fragments. Because the sea does not rise evenly. It lingers, creeps, then surges. An earthquake here, a calving glacier there, a volcanic island collapsing into its own caldera. Each moment local, but together a pattern. We now know sea levels rose over 400 feet at the end of the last ice age. That entire regions were inundated, coastlines redrawn, islands erased, and with them whatever was there vanished not in fire, but in water. And still the stories survive, not with coordinates, not with blueprints, but with meaning. What if Atlantis was not a place but a memory shape? A template our ancestors used to understand something they could not control? What if each culture placed its own loss into the myth, retold, reinterpreted, but always circling the same ache? The ache of something gone. And perhaps the myths persist because we feel that ache still. The ocean remains just beyond reach, beautiful, vast, and unknowable. We suspect it hides something. We feel it when we stand at the edge and stare into the horizon. Not fear, not fantasy, recognition. We may never prove that Atlantis or any sunken city existed as described, but that may not matter. What matters is the pattern, the pulse beneath the tales, the shared human memory of water rising, of land disappearing, of knowledge slipping beneath the waves before it could be saved. And if every flood myth, every drowning story, every whispered tale of a lost land is a thread in a larger tapestry, then we must ask, what is it that we're trying to remember? And why is the ocean still holding that memory just out of reach? Because if Atlantis wasn't alone, if the world is full of such stories, then perhaps we were never meant to forget. Perhaps the sea is not the end of these stories, but the place they've all gone to sleep, waiting, still waiting to be retold. There is a kind of architecture in the sea not made by hands, but by life itself, built cell by cell, tiny bodies layered upon the bones of those that came before. Slow, deliberate, quiet, coral. It does not shout. It does not move. And yet, reef by reef, it builds cathedrals from calcium, rising like breath from the ocean floor. An animal and a stone, a colony and a skeleton. Coral is not just life, it is memory turned into form. Every branch, every ridge, every spiral that catches the current is a record of survival. A blueprint of centuries lived one tide at a time. These structures are not random, they are instruction, pattern, inheritance. And when we dive among them, we are not entering a garden. We are entering a library. Coral reefs are among the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They are homes, nurseries, feeding grounds, sanctuaries. They house species not found anywhere else. But beyond their beauty, beyond the darting colors and luminous shells, lies something older, something deeper. Corals leave fossils. When a reef dies, it does not vanish. The skeleton remains, layered beneath sediment, preserved in limestone, a record pressed into the stone, telling us where the oceans were warm, where the currents flowed, where life once flourished. We can read climate in those fossils, trace sea levels, temperatures, acidity. Some coral beds date back hundreds of millions of years. And in those records we find rhythm. Boom, collapse, regrowth. Coral has survived ice ages, mass extinctions, dramatic shifts in chemistry and current. It has endured until now. Today, reefs are disappearing. Not over eons, but within decades. Waters grow too warm, storms too strong. The ocean's more acidic, more polluted, more unstable. Coral, delicate as it is ancient, bleaches. It loses the algae that feed it. It goes pale, then brittle, then silent. In some regions, entire reefs that once stretched for miles are now skeletal ghostlands, bone-colored remnants of once living cities. And yet, the structures still stand. Their forms still echo the vitality they once held. They whisper warnings in their stillness, not just of loss, but of balance tipping. Because coral does not die in isolation. It is the foundation. When it fades, the sea forgets how to feed certain fish. The food web shifts. Entire populations move or vanish. Ecosystems loosen their grip on place. And if the reef dies, something else goes with it. The record. Without coral, the ocean loses one of its most precise scribes. One of its clearest storytellers. One of its oldest architects. We are not just watching extinction. We are watching the erasure of memory in real time. But even now, some corals resist. There are species more tolerant to heat. Some that can adapt, shift their algae, recover after stress. Scientists are studying these survivors, planting coral nurseries, breeding resilience into the blueprint. It is a quiet kind of hope, one that asks not for reversal but for restoration. Still, the warning remains, because coral, in its fossilized form, has always told the truth. It has shown us where the seas rose, where they warmed too fast, where extinction once brushed the edge of the reef. We ignored those whispers, and now the reef itself begins to vanish. We build our cities on steel and stone. Coral builds its world on memory, and that memory is fragile. Yet even in collapse it leaves clues. In the fossilized ridges of ancient reefs. In the calcium ratios embedded in their cores. In the precise growth rings like tree rings written in bone. The past is there if we choose to read it. And perhaps, buried in coral are lessons we haven't yet learned. About balance, about slowness, about how life constructs its own shelter over time. Coral has always been a blueprint. Not just for reef systems, but for coexistence. For complexity, for endurance. And now, those blueprints lie broken in the shallows, or buried in the stone below us, waiting. Still waiting for us to understand what they were trying to build. But if coral can remember so much in silence, what might we lose when the last reef goes quiet? Names are fragile things. They hold places in the mouth long after the places themselves have vanished. They travel through time disguised as syllables, tucked into lullabies, tangled in prayer, embedded in the rhythm of myth. And when the tide takes the land, sometimes it takes the language, too. Across the world, there are words we still speak, words whose origins are unclear, whose meanings have softened into mystery. The names of rivers that no longer flow. The names of gods whose altars were washed away. The names of islands that now sleep beneath salt water. We don't always know where they came from, only that they linger. What if these words are driftwood? What if they are all that remains of voices that once stood on lost shores, pointing to mountains, naming stars, describing winds that no longer blow the same way? In many ancient cultures, language was landscape. Words were not just labels, they were maps, rituals, relationships. To speak the name of a place was to acknowledge its power, its presence. And when the place was lost, to flood, to erosion, to tectonic collapse, the word became an orphan. Unmoored, but still floating. The ocean has swallowed more than land. It has taken entire lexicons. Doggerland, now beneath the North Sea, once connected Britain to the continent. Archaeologists believe it was home to thriving Mesolithic communities, rich in tradition and speech. But their words are gone. No written trace, no translation. Only the objects they left behind, tools, bones, carvings, and the knowledge that they must have had a name for sea, for shelter, for themselves. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators carried oral traditions across thousands of miles of ocean. Stories encoded in song, direction, star positions, the shapes of swells. Some of those stories remember places that are no longer there. Lands lost to rising seas, to volcanic collapse, to slow drowning across generations. But the names survived barely, sometimes as myths, sometimes as scattered syllables in chants that no longer make sense, but still demand to be sung. Even in the Mediterranean, place names persist from times before recorded history. Is it possible that some of these names are older than we imagine? That they are fossil words, carried forward unconsciously, passed down through conquest and colonization, layered over but never entirely erased? Language is like sediment. It accumulates, compresses, drifts, and sometimes it resurfaces. Some etymologists trace connections between coastal words spoken thousands of miles apart, fragments that resemble one another in sound, in meaning, in mystery. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps a deeper echo, passed from tongue to tongue, across floods and migrations, across civilizations remembered only by myth. Because language, like the ocean, is always moving, and what it carries is not always visible on the surface. When a people lose their homeland to the sea, they often carry only what cannot be drowned. Their words, their stories, their names. These are packed into memory, into song, into breath, passed down as heritage, even when the origin is forgotten. A grandmother's phrase, a prayer whose meaning has worn thin with time, a tale of a place that now lives only in imagination, told to children on moonlit nights. And in this way some names survive, not because we understand them, but because we need them, because they anchor us to something we can't quite remember, but know we came from. Perhaps you've spoken such a word without knowing it. A place name that means nothing in modern language, but once meant everything. A myth that feels familiar even if its details have changed. These may be the final traces of languages drowned with their lands, echoes in the breath of our everyday. And if the sea continues to rise, if more coasts vanish, more communities scatter, how many more names will drift from meaning to memory? But perhaps, as long as someone speaks a word, it still exists. Even if the place it once described has been lost. Even if the voice that first shaped it is gone. Perhaps some names don't need land to live. Perhaps they are the land, reborn in breath. And if that's true, how many voices are still with us, hidden in the way we speak, in the way we remember without knowing why? There is a quiet question that lives beneath the waves. Not scientific, not measurable, but persistent, like a thought that keeps surfacing when everything else goes still. If a world vanished, and no one was left to remember it, did it still matter? We measure history by what survives: ruins, records, witnesses, the things that endure, the things that can be seen, catalogued, placed in museums. But what of the civilizations that left no stone? The cultures built along coastlines now buried by rising seas? The people who lived, loved, dreamed, and disappeared? What do we do with a story that has no storyteller? Geology can tell us that land once existed. Biology can show us where life once thrived. But meaning, that quiet, invisible thing, is harder to preserve, and harder still to assign once all the voices are gone. There may have been entire peoples whose names were never carved in stone, whose knowledge lived in breath and gesture, in woven cloth and oral song, in patterns passed from mother to child. When the sea rose, or the fault lines shifted, or the rains did not come, that knowledge may have gone silent, drowned with no archive, no epitaph. But does memory need a witness to be real? Must something be known to be sacred? The earth remembers in form, in layers, in pressure. But we remember through empathy, through the fragile recognition that someone, somewhere, once stood here and called it home. That they mattered, not because we know them, but because they were. Still, this is difficult. Our ethics are shaped by proximity. We care most for what we can see, but the past asks us to care for what is gone, for the unseen, for the voiceless. It asks us to assign dignity to those we will never meet, to recognize the value in presence that left no record. Can we do that? We often assume that if something left no legacy, it was insignificant, that only the remembered were worthy, that history belongs to the victors, the builders, the preservers. But maybe we are wrong. Maybe significance is not measured by endurance, but by existence. There may have been civilizations who mastered the ocean in ways we cannot imagine, who mapped the stars before they had paper, who cured illness with plants we now call weeds. There may have been songs sung for 1,000 years that now echo only in salt water. Entire languages that shape thought in ways we no longer understand. They mattered, not because they reached us, but because they reached themselves. And so the sea becomes not only an archive, but a cemetery of unnamed brilliance. To stand at the shore is to face that truth. To know that somewhere beneath, there may be tools, bones, vessels, words, all softened into silt, all waiting for someone to ask the right question, or perhaps no longer needing to be found at all, because maybe presence doesn't require permanence. Maybe it is enough that they were here. Maybe value does not depend on visibility. Maybe a world without witnesses still leaves an imprint on the fabric of being. A ripple that shaped what came next, even if we can't trace the source. The ocean teaches us this. It is full of life we never see, full of movements too slow to feel, full of stories unfolding right now in silence. And yet none of it is less real. So why should the past be different? If a civilization rises, thrives, and falls, and is never remembered, can we still call it beautiful? Can we still honor it? Perhaps that is the deeper question. Not did it matter, but will we let it matter now? Will we allow space in our imagination, in our empathy, for the unseen, the unrecorded, the forgotten not by failure, but by the passing of time? Maybe the ocean doesn't keep these stories for us to find. Maybe it keeps them because that's what water does. It holds, surrounds. It remembers even without names. And maybe our task is not to recover every lost world, but to believe that they mattered even if we never do. But if this is true, if value lives beyond witness, then how many other voices have already shaped us, invisibly, from beneath the waves? And what kind of witnesses are we, to those who will someday wonder the same about us? There are moments when time feels less like a line and more like a circle, a quiet spiral folding in on itself. Moments when the past isn't behind us, and the future isn't ahead, but both seem to brush against the present, like the tide brushing your feet, and then slipping away. We've spent this journey looking backward, into drowned continents, extinct creatures, languages without speakers, and structures too eroded to name. We've chased echoes into trenches and sediment cores, looking for pieces of the world that once was. But perhaps, in doing so, we've also been peering forward into what might be. Because the search for lost worlds is never just about the past. It's about what we value, what we notice, what we fear losing, and what we still hope to find. What we choose to remember shapes what we choose to become. If we see the sea only as an archive, full of old, drowned stories, we risk forgetting that it is also a mirror, reflecting who we are now, reflecting what we are choosing, what we are building, what we are letting slip beneath the waves once more. Entropy is always in motion, not just in the ocean floor but in us. Cities rise and dissolve. Languages shift. Forests become fields, become streets, become dust. But in the face of that slow fading, we dream, we build, we ask questions. We wonder what came before, not just to solve the past, but to feel less alone in time. Perhaps every lost world we seek is also a model, a shape, caution, a whisper of what happens when we lose balance. But maybe it's also something gentler, an offering, a reminder that life rebuilds, that memory can be layered, that even what disappears can still leave warmth in its absence. We imagine the future as something distant, waiting to unfold. But perhaps it's already behind us, half-formed in the choices we've made, in the stories we've inherited. Perhaps we are living within the unfinished dream of those who came before us, those who once stood at the edge of their own sea, wondering what would come next. And perhaps we are the ancestors now, our carbon, our architecture, our words, pressed into sediment, waiting to be found. What will future beings see when they look back at us? Will they understand our contradictions, our hunger to preserve and our carelessness in letting go? Will they see us as a turning point, a tragedy, a curiosity, or something gentler, Just another layer in the long dance of entropy and emergence? To dream forward is to imagine what stories will survive us. To remember back is to let those older stories inform how we live now. The ocean does both. It holds the fossil and the future in the same breath. It carries ice age carbon and plastic microfibers together on the same current. It remembers the warmth of ancient atmospheres and stores the heat of the one we're still shaping. The question isn't whether the Earth will remember. It will. The question is, what kind of memory will we become? Soft sediment can preserve, but it can also erase. Entropy decides nothing. It only waits. And we, brief, luminous creatures that we are, can choose how to fold our stories into the sea. With care. With recklessness. With hope. Maybe the most enduring part of humanity is not what we build, but what we wonder. Our restless curiosity. Our reaching backward and forward in the same breath. Our refusal to accept that a mystery must remain closed, even if the answer is hidden under miles of salt and time. The past may be buried, and the future unwritten. But between them lies this strange moment, the present, where we are both archaeologist and ancestor, reader and writer, sleeper and dreamer, and maybe, just maybe, the dream we haven't had yet already remembers us. But if the ocean carries the past and the future together in its tide, then perhaps every question we ask it now becomes a kind of offering, cast forward, hoping someone will find it and remember. The sea does not speak in sentences. It speaks in cycles, in slow turns of tide, in salt carried on wind, in patterns too vast to trace from shore. And yet, it remembers, not as we do, not in detail or definition, but in essence. It remembers through shape, through silence, through the gentle layering of everything that has ever fallen into it. What we forget, the ocean still keeps. Somewhere in its deepest layers lies the carbon of ancient trees, the bones of creatures long extinct, the ashes of forgotten fires. Somewhere, entombed in silt, are the footprints of coastal children who laughed in languages no longer spoken. Somewhere beneath the weight of water are cities, stories, names, all quiet now. Not gone, just submerged. We often look to land for memory. Ruins, artifacts, books, the evidence we can touch. But the sea is older. The sea was here before language, before stone, before the lines we drew to measure history. It has always held more than it reveals. It held the first breath of life, the first dividing cell, the first creatures that dared to drift toward the light. It has carried every generation since. Sometimes nurturing, sometimes erasing, always flowing forward, even as it loops back. And though we try to contain it, to name it, to map it, to hold it in our instruments, the sea remains just beyond our reach. Vast, fluid, unfinished, like memory, because memory is not static. It moves, it erodes and builds. It returns in waves, unexpected, altered, but familiar. The sea behaves the same. It does not store the past. It is the past, alive, dynamic, reshaping itself around what it holds. And we, like so many before us, are passing through it. Our bodies mostly water. Our rhythms shaped by tides we do not see. Our stories drifting like plankton into the current. Perhaps that's why the sea calls to us, not just with beauty, but with recognition. Something in us knows we came from it. Not just in a biological sense, but in something quieter, in some deep internal tide that feels the pull of the waves not as place, but as origin. We stand at the edge of the ocean not to see the horizon, but to feel the presence of everything we can't explain, to ask questions older than language, to remember what we didn't know we had forgotten. We have talked of drowned worlds and buried fossils, of tectonics and entropy, of memory in coral, in currents, in silence. But beneath all of it lies something softer still. The truth that none of this was ever truly lost. The sea kept it, as it always does. Kept the ruins. Kept the warmth. Kept the scars. It even kept the dreams. And it is still keeping them now. When we send sonar into the depths, when we drag core samples from the mud, when we translate isotopes into stories, we are not discovering new truths. We are recovering old ones. The ocean already knew. What we find is what it has cradled all along. And what it holds is not just evidence, but emotion, the reverence of time, the quietness of change, the humility of being part of something so much larger than we can measure. Because if the sea is memory, then it is not just remembering the earth. It is remembering us. Every boat, every ritual, every scattering of ashes, every migration, every lost name spoken into the wind, carries them, dilutes them, circulates them in loops that span generations. And maybe, just maybe, it offers them back. A shard of pottery, a strand of DNA, a myth that feels too familiar, a glow in the dark that shouldn't be there, a question we can't stop asking. The sea does not forget, but it does not give freely. It waits. It offers only to those who come gently, with patience, with wonder, with enough silence to hear the answer when it arrives, not as fact, but as presence. And so we end not with certainty, but with surrender, to the vastness, to the motion, to the knowing that does not need proof to be real. Because perhaps the sea has always been not just where memory is stored, but where it lives, not a vault, but a consciousness, shapeless, soundless, still awake. And if that's true, if the sea is memory itself, then every wave that touches shore is not just water, but story. And every step we take away from it is not forgetting, but carrying it forward, quietly, in the current of our breath.